Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe a blanket, maybe a drink, maybe just the quiet corner of the room where the day finally lets go of you for a while. Tonight we're going somewhere that history books love to describe from above, with kings, parliaments, powdered wigs, grand houses, wars, scandals, and portraits of people who look as if they have never once had mud on their shoes. But we're not starting in a palace. We're not beginning with George II or George III, or with a minister at Westminster, or with a duchess stepping down from a painted carriage. We're going into the street, not a clean street, not a polite street, not the London street you see in costume dramas where everyone seems to have enough room to walk, and the worst thing that happens is a gentleman tips his hat too slowly. We are going into Georgian London as it actually pressed itself against ordinary people. Loud, crowded, smoky, restless, full of carts and horses and shouted prices and church bells and sewage and shop signs and beggars and apprentices and sailors and servants and women carrying baskets and men watching other men's hands. Because in this city, in the 1700s, one of the most dangerous things you could do was believe that the pocket in your coat belonged only to you. That is the world we're stepping into tonight. A world where a person could walk out in the morning with a purse, a watch, a handkerchief, a silver snuff box, a small bundle of wages, or even just a folded letter tucked safely away, and return home with nothing but confusion and the sick feeling that comes when you patch your coat and find empty cloth. Pickpockets did not simply exist in Georgian London. They became part of the city's rhythm. They moved through fairs, markets, bridges, theatres, churchyards, execution crowds, tavern doors and narrow lanes with a confidence that could be almost professional. Some were adults who'd been stealing for years. Some were women whose skirts and cloaks gave them cover in the crush of a crowd. Some were boys so young that modern people would call them children before calling them criminals, and yet they knew how to cut a purse string, lift a watch, pass stolen goods from one hand to another, and vanish before the victim had finished turning around. And here is the thing that makes this story more unsettling than a simple tale of crime. The pickpocket did not take over Georgian London because London was lawless in some simple way. There were laws, there were constables, there were courts, there were punishments so harsh that they now seem almost impossible to reconcile with the smallness of the theft. A handkerchief could become a hanging matter if the value was high enough or the charge was framed severely enough. People were whipped, transported, branded, imprisoned, or sent to the gallows. The punishment was public. The warning was meant to be obvious, and still the hands kept moving. Still the pockets were emptied. Still the city produced more thieves than it could catch, and more crowds than it could protect. So before we move too deeply into this world, I want you to picture something very ordinary. Picture yourself walking through a city street. Not rushing exactly, but moving with purpose. You know where you're going. Maybe you have errands to do. Maybe you are meeting someone. Maybe you're just passing through. Around you, people are brushing close. Someone steps in front of you and slows down. Someone behind you bumps your shoulder. A cellar calls out from one side. A cartwheel catches in a rut. A child darts past your knees. You feel annoyed for half a second, maybe distracted, maybe a little crowded but not alarmed. Then a few minutes later, you reach for what you carried with you, and it is gone. No knife drawn, no threat spoken, no face to remember clearly, just absence. That was the genius of the pickpocket's crime. It left no dramatic scene behind. It turned the victim's own body into the place of discovery. You did not know you had been robbed at the moment it happened. You learned it afterward, when the thief was already somewhere else. What time is it where you are listening from tonight? Is it late enough that your own streets are quiet? Are you hearing traffic outside or rain, or the low sound of a house settling around you? I ask, because it is strange to think how safe our pockets feel now. We check a phone, a wallet, a key, and we take for granted that the objects we carry have a kind of invisible border around them. We still have theft, Of course we do. But many of us move through the world with a confidence that would have seemed foolish in parts of 18th century London. A Georgian Londoner going through a crowd didn't merely walk. He guarded. She guarded. They felt for purse strings. They held their coats close. They knew that a shove might not be an accident, that a child pressing too near might not be lost, that a polite stranger asking for directions might be buying time for someone else's fingers. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like the history that happens below the level of kings and battles, the history of rooms, streets, habits, fears, and ordinary people trying to get through an ordinary day, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it now. Do it when you feel that small pull, when some detail catches you and makes the past feel less like a date in a textbook, and more like a place where someone once stood breathing. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from, your city, your country, your couch, your bed, your kitchen table, at some unreasonable hour, leave it in the comments. I genuinely enjoy knowing where these stories travel. Now, let us go back. Not to London as a postcard, but London as a working, swelling, difficult city in the Georgian age. The years stretch across the reigns of the George, from the early 1700s into the first decades of the 1800s. But tonight we are mostly interested in the long 18th century, when London was becoming one of the largest and most complicated cities in the world. Its population grew with a force that the old streets could barely absorb. People arrived from the countryside looking for work. Sailors came off ships with wages in their pockets, and very little caution left after months at sea. Servants carried messages and money between houses. Apprentices ran errands. Shopkeepers stood behind counters in open-fronted businesses where goods could be seen from the street. Gentlemen moved between coffee houses, clubs, theatres and law courts. Women shopped in markets and walked to churches and visited friends. The whole city was a machine of movement, and pickpockets understood movement better than almost anyone. London did not offer them wide, clean boulevards in the modern sense. It offered lanes where bodies had to pass close. It offered markets so crowded that a person could hardly tell whether a touch came from a thief or simply from the pressure of the crowd. It offered fairs where noise and drink and excitement lowered everyone's guard. It offered public punishments that drew thousands of spectators, and those spectators were often robbed while watching other thieves be punished. That detail tells you almost everything. Even the gallows could become a workplace for the pickpocket. Even the official theatre of justice, designed to frighten criminals into obedience, created exactly the kind of crowd in which a skilled hand could disappear. There was something about Georgian clothing that helped the trade as well. Pockets were not always arranged as ours are now. Men often carried watches attached by chains, purses, handkerchiefs, seals, keys, and small cases in coat pockets or waistcoat pockets. Women's pockets could be separate fabric pouches tied around the waist under the skirt, reached through slits in the gown. A thief who knew the construction of clothing knew where to look. A cut purse in earlier centuries might literally cut the purse from a belt. But by the Georgian period, the work could be subtler. A handkerchief might be drawn from a pocket so smoothly that the owner never felt the movement. A watch might be lifted with a practiced twist. A purse might be eased out during a staged collision. The body became a map, and thieves studied that map from childhood. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to sit with, but it matters. Many of the most skilled pickpockets began very young. Not because childhood was romantic, and not because every poor child became a thief, which would be false and unfair. Most poor children worked, begged, helped at home, carried goods, sold small items, entered service, or survived in whatever way their family could manage. But London had an enormous population of children who lived near the edge. Some had lost parents, some had run away from masters, some slept in lodging houses, under stalls, in alleys, or in the corners of rooms where adults barely noticed them. Some were drawn into networks of older thieves who understood that a child could slip through a crowd more easily than a grown man, and that a child's face could appear harmless for just long enough. Imagine being 10 years old in that city, Not 10 years old as we understand it now, with school and birthdays and someone keeping track of your bedtime, but 10 in a London lane where hunger is not a lesson. It is the condition of the morning. You learn what adults ignore. You learn that a drunk man leaving a tavern pats the same pocket again and again, because that is where his money is. You learn that a gentleman watching a street performer forgets his watch chain. You learn that people entering church are solemn, but people leaving church are social, distracted, greeting neighbours, adjusting gloves, looking for carriages. You learn that markets have their own weather, their own cover, their own noise. You learn that a crowd is not a group of people, it is shelter. That is the first real secret of Georgian pickpocketing. It was not only about quick fingers, it was about reading the street. A clumsy thief grabs, a skilled pickpocket waits. He sees where a person's attention has gone. She sees which pocket has weight in it. A boy sees which gentleman is new to London by the way he stares upward at signs or turns his head too sharply at every shout. The city was full of signals. Clothing signalled wealth. Accent signalled origin. Pace signalled familiarity. A careful Londoner moved differently from a visitor. A sailor newly paid had a different looseness in his body from a clerk with only a few coins. A countryman at Bartholomew Fair might be overwhelmed enough to become careless within minutes. A thief did not need everyone to be foolish. He needed one person to be distracted at the right distance for the right length of time, and the distractions were everywhere. Georgian London was not quiet even at night. By day it was a continuous collision of business. Street sellers cried their goods in voices trained to cut through noise. Chairmen carried sedan chairs through narrow ways. Hackney coaches splashed through filth. Dogs ran loose. Horses backed, kicked, stamped and dropped manure where people walked. Shop signs hung over streets before numbering became standardised, creaking in the wind and sometimes large enough to darken the way below. Bells rang from churches. Ballad singers performed songs based on recent crimes and scandals. Beggars pleaded, newsboys shouted. People gathered around disputes because people have always gathered around disputes. If a man tripped, people looked. If a woman cried out, people looked. If a street performer balanced something absurd or a seller promised some miracle cure, people looked. And whenever people looked with their eyes, their pockets were being trusted to luck. The authorities knew this. Moralists wrote about it. Newspapers warned readers. The Old Bailey, London's central criminal court, recorded case after case in which victims described the same bewildering pattern. They were in a crowd. They felt a push. They missed an object. Someone nearby accused someone else. A chase began. Sometimes the accused thief still had the goods. Sometimes the goods had already been passed to an accomplice, which made the arrest useless unless witnesses could prove the exchange. That passing of stolen property was one of the most important parts of the work. A pickpocket who kept the stolen item on his body was vulnerable. A pickpocket who lifted it and immediately handed it to another person became hard to convict. The hand that stole and the hand that carried did not have to be the same hand. This is where the story becomes less like a single thief acting alone and more like a street economy. There were receivers who bought stolen goods. There were lodging houses where stolen handkerchiefs, watches, buckles and small items could be hidden or broken down. There were fences who understood the value of silver, cloth, metal and clothing. There were taverns where criminals, constables, informers and victims could all move through the same rooms. There were thief-takers who made money by capturing criminals or pretending to capture them, sometimes honestly, sometimes as part of arrangements that were hardly cleaner than the crimes they claimed to punish. London did not have a modern professional police force for most of the Georgian period. It had parish constables, watchmen, magistrates, rewards, private prosecution, and a great deal of improvisation. That meant catching a pickpocket could depend less on a system than on speed, witnesses, money, anger, and chance. Think about that for a moment. If your watch was stolen today, you might be frustrated, but you would know the basic shape of what to do. Report it, cancel something, track something, call someone. In Georgian London, the victim often had to become part of the chase. A cry of "Stop thief!" could turn a street into a sudden hunt. People might join in, not always because they cared about justice, but because the chase itself was exciting, or because there might be a reward, or because the city had trained them to respond to that cry. The accused thief might run into a court, a passage, a shop, a crowd, a tavern, or across a market. If caught, he might be beaten before reaching a magistrate. If not caught quickly, he might become another story told with frustration over supper. The city swallowed him. There is a temptation when telling a story like this to make the pickpocket into a charming rogue. Popular culture has done that many times. Quick smile, quicker hands, a child of the streets outwitting the rich. And yes, there were thieves with wit. There were criminals who performed their identities with confidence. There were ballads and pamphlets that turned certain figures into legends. But for the person robbed, especially an ordinary person, the loss could be serious. A servant losing wages might be accused of dishonesty herself. A tradesman losing a purse might be unable to pay a debt. A woman losing keys could face not only inconvenience but suspicion. A sailor losing months of pay could fall into a tavern economy that stripped him further. The stolen object was not always a luxury. Sometimes it was the small margin between stability and ruin. At the same time, it would be too easy to describe the thieves only as villains and leave it there. Georgian London was harsh to the poor, and the line between survival and crime could be thin in ways that do not excuse theft but do help explain why the streets produce so much of it. Work was irregular. Wages could be low. Apprenticeships could be brutal. Food prices rose and fell with frightening consequences. Kin shops offered escape and destruction in equal measure. Debtors' prisons, workhouses, and the threat of transportation hung over people who were already living close to desperation. A child who learned to steal was not born with a special criminal nature. He was shaped by a city that had places for him to hide, people willing to use him, victims close enough to touch, and punishments that came too late to prevent the next theft. So tonight, as we begin, I do not want us to stand safely outside this world and point at it. I want us to walk through it carefully. I want us to understand how the city made the crime possible, how the clothing helped, how crowds worked, how children were trained, how women participated in ways history sometimes overlooks, how the courts described these cases in dry language while real people stood terrified in front of judges, how a stolen handkerchief could carry a person toward a prison ship or the gallows, how public fear of pickpockets became one of the background noises of London life, like wheels on stone or bells in the fog. Let us begin with the street at a busy hour, not the empty street of early morning, before the shops open and before the day has gathered itself, but the street when London is fully awake and no one has enough space. The air smells of coal smoke, horse sweat, damp wool, frying food, spilled ale, river mud, and human waste. A woman with a basket pushes past an apprentice carrying a parcel. A gentleman pauses to avoid a puddle and exposes the side of his coat for only a second. A boy no one is watching moves closer. Another boy calls out to someone behind him. A cart lurches. The gentleman turns his head. One hand lifts the flap. One hand draws the cloth. One hand passes the stolen thing away. The gentleman steps forward, still owning himself in his own mind, still believing the morning is proceeding as planned. Behind him, the city has already edited the contents of his life. This was not chaos to the pickpocket. This was opportunity arranged by habit. Londoners knew the busiest places, but thieves knew the busiest moments. A market at opening, a theatre at closing, a church door after service, a bridge when traffic slowed, a fair when drink had warmed the crowd, a hanging when everyone's eyes were fixed on the cart, the rope, and the condemned person's face. Georgian London gave pickpockets what all thieves need most: closeness without intimacy. Strangers pressed against one another constantly, but no one was expected to know every face. A touch could be accidental, a bump could be ordinary, a cry could be lost in louder cries. The city itself became an accomplice, not because it intended crime, but because its shape, noise, poverty, wealth, and crowding made crime easier than order. And somewhere in that crowd, long before the victim notices anything is wrong, there is a young thief learning the first lesson of the trade, not how to steal, that comes slightly later. The first lesson is how to look as if you are not there, how to make your body part of the street's background, how to stand near a person without seeming to choose him, how to move when everyone else moves, how to stop when the crowd stops, how to use your face as cover. A skilled pickpocket's fingers mattered, but his patience mattered more. His courage mattered too, because every attempt carried danger. A failed theft could mean a beating, a court, a sentence, a voyage across the world, or a rope. Yet the hands kept moving, because for some the street had already become a school, a workplace, and a trap. And Georgian London was very good at making all three look like the same place. If you stood in London on a busy morning sometime in the middle of the 1700s, the first thing you would notice was not the elegance. It would not be the fine coats, or the powdered hair, or the shining coach lamps outside a great house in Mayfair. Those things existed, of course, and Georgian London loved display. It loved polished silver, imported silk, carved shop fronts, coffee houses full of opinion, pleasure gardens glowing after dark, and gentlemen who dressed as if the whole city were a stage built for them personally. But before any of that reached you, the city itself would hit you. The sound, the smell, the closeness of it. Wheels grinding over stone, horses stamping in filth, chairmen shouting as they carried sedan chairs through narrow ways, women calling prices from baskets, porters bent under loads, apprentices laughing too loudly because they were young and had been sent into the street with more energy than judgment, church bells marking time over a place where almost no one had enough of it. And through all of this, brushing past sleeves and skirts and coat pockets, were the hands that made Georgian London nervous. The city was growing faster than older habits could manage. At the start of the 18th century, London held roughly 500,000 people, and by the first reliable modern census in 1801, Greater London counted just over 1 million. That kind of growth did not simply mean more houses, more shops and more streets. It meant more strangers, more errands, more crowds where no one could account for every shoulder that pressed against them. More wages carried in cloth purses. More watches worn as marks of respectability. More handkerchiefs, snuff boxes, seals, buckles, letters, keys, ribbons, and small personal objects moving through public space every hour of the day. A larger city did not merely create more people to rob, it created more chances for a thief to stand close to someone without being noticed. This is the part we have to understand first. Pickpocketing was not just a crime that happened in London, it was a crime that London helped design. The shape of the streets, the density of the markets, the noise of trade, the habits of dress, the absence of a modern police force, the constant movement between rich and poor districts, all of it worked together to create a city where the human body became a kind of open shop front. A gentleman might think of his watch as tucked away safely, but to a trained thief the chain itself announced the prize. A woman might believe the pocket tied under her skirt was hidden, but a child who had watched women reach through the slit in their gowns knew exactly where it hung. A servant might carry a small packet for a mistress, a clerk might carry papers and coins, a sailor might carry months of pay after coming off the river, and every one of them brought private property into a public world that was too crowded to protect it. Now, picture the pocket itself, because it was not quite the modern thing we imagine. Men's coats and waistcoats held deep pockets, but deep did not mean safe. A pocket with weight in it pulled differently. It changed the line of the garment. A purse, a watch, or a handkerchief created a small visible language if you knew how to read cloth. A watch chain glinting across a waistcoat was almost an advertisement. A bulging side pocket told its own story. A fine linen handkerchief, carelessly tucked, was not just a square of fabric. In the 1700s, cloth still mattered. Good linen cost money, lace cost more. A stolen handkerchief could be sold, traded, or used as evidence if the thief was unlucky enough to be caught with it. We tend to think of pickpocketing as the theft of coins, but in Georgian London almost anything portable had value. A pair of shoe buckles, a silver pencil, a snuff box, a small book, a glove, a seal, a tobacco pouch, a ribbon, a watch key. The city taught thieves to see value in details that respectable people barely noticed. And because so many objects were carried on the body, the thief did not need to break into a house to steal from you. He could wait until you brought the house's smaller treasures outside. That was the unsettling genius of the trade. A locked door meant nothing if the owner walked into Covent Garden with the valuable thing in his coat. A strong box meant nothing if wages were tied in a purse under an apron. A careful servant could still lose an item in a crowd because care was no match for two people working together, one to distract and one to take. The city turned every errand into a small exposure. Buying food, attending church, crossing London Bridge, standing at a bookseller's window, watching a quarrel, entering a theatre, leaving a tavern, waiting near a coach, listening to a ballad singer. Every one of these ordinary acts placed the body among strangers. There is something almost uncomfortable about that because we still know this feeling a little. You are in a train station or a crowded street and someone comes too close behind you. You touch your phone or wallet without thinking. You do not do it because you are certain there is a thief nearby. You do it because the body has a memory of vulnerability. Georgian Londoners lived with that feeling far more openly. They did not have zippers, contactless bank cards, password locks, insurance forms, or a police station in the modern sense waiting to take over the problem. If something was stolen, the first seconds mattered. You shouted, you grabbed, you chased, you accused, or you stood there stunned, while the person who had taken it was already turning a corner, handing the object away, or becoming just another face in the moving street. The busiest places were the most dangerous, and London had no shortage of them. Cheapside, with its shops and passing trade. The Strand, carrying people between the city and Westminster. Fleet Street, thick with printers, lawyers, taverns, and news. Smithfield, where cattle, drovers, butchers, buyers, and onlookers created a confusion that must have felt like a gift to a thief. Covent Garden, with its market by day and its theatres and pleasure-seeking crowds by night. The Royal Exchange, where merchants, brokers, messengers and curious visitors mingled beneath the pressure of business. St Paul's Churchyard, where booksellers, worshippers, idlers and passers-by created the kind of mixed crowd in which no one looked out of place for very long. These were not simply locations. They were opportunities with street names. A market was especially useful because everyone had a reason to touch, reach, lean, turn, and stop. Imagine a woman trying to judge the freshness of fish while keeping her skirt away from mud and listening to a seller swear that the price had never been fairer. Imagine a boy passing behind her carrying nothing at all. He does not run. Running draws the eye. He lets the movement of the market carry him. A basket knocks against her hip. Someone to her left complains loudly about being cheated. She turns for a moment. The boy's hand moves where her own hand moved a minute earlier, to the slit in the gown, to the pocket tied beneath. Maybe he gets nothing. Maybe he gets a key, a coin, a scrap, a thimble, a small purse. Maybe she notices. Maybe she does not. The attempt itself lasts less time than it takes to finish a sentence. Theatre crowds were another kind of harvest. A person entering a theatre was already thinking about being seen. Clothing mattered there. Manners mattered. Seats mattered. Recognition mattered. Outside Drury Lane or Covent Garden Theatre, People gathered in a mood that was neither work nor worship. They were excited, impatient, distracted, and dressed better than they might be on an ordinary errand. Coaches stopped. Footmen called. Tickets were handled. Doors narrowed the crowd into a press of bodies. That narrowing was important. A wide street gives people space to protect themselves. A doorway takes that space away. The crowd does the thief's pushing for him. A hand at the pocket can be explained by the surge of bodies. A missing watch is discovered only after the victim has passed inside, looked around, greeted someone, settled into the performance, and finally noticed that the reassuring wait is gone. Churches offered a different kind of opening. It sounds strange at first, almost indecent to imagine theft near worship, but churches gathered people regularly, predictably, and in large numbers. The moment after a service could be especially useful. People emerged slowly. They spoke to neighbours. They adjusted gloves and cloaks. They looked for family members or carriages. Their minds were half on the sermon and half on dinner. Even moral seriousness can make a person careless if it turns the eyes inward. A pickpocket did not need the whole congregation to be distracted. He needed one man, one woman, one loose pocket, one moment in the doorway where everyone paused because the people outside were not moving fast enough. Fairs may have been the richest ground of all. Bartholomew Fair in Smithfield and Southwark Fair across the river were famous not only for entertainment, but for disorder. A fair brought together country visitors, city apprentices, hawkers, performers, gamblers, drinkers, prostitutes, children, servants and thieves in a temporary world where ordinary rules loosened. There were booths, puppet shows, rope dancers, animals, food, drink, noise, and enough novelty to keep eyes moving everywhere except toward one's own pocket. Southwark Fair was abolished in the 1760s, and Bartholomew Fair would survive longer, but in the Georgian imagination these places carried a reputation for both pleasure and danger. The fair was a holiday for the honest and dishonest alike. The difference was that the thief went there to work, and then there were the execution crowds, which tell us something blunt and almost unbelievable about the city. Public hangings were meant to instruct the population. They were supposed to show what happened to crime. But a hanging also drew a crowd, and a crowd drew pickpockets. People came to watch a condemned person die, and some of them lost their watches while doing it. There is a terrible irony in that image. A man might stand at Tyburn listening to prayers and warnings about sin, while another man behind him lifted a handkerchief from his coat. The state displayed punishment in public, and the city's thieves treated the audience as a working environment. Crime and justice did not stand on opposite sides of the street. In Georgian London, they often pressed against the same rope line. Court records from the Old Bailey show why these stories survive with such detail. The published proceedings were accounts of criminal trials, usually giving the defendant's name, the offence, witness testimony, verdict, and sentence, and many cases preserve the small practical details of how thefts were noticed, pursued, and prosecuted. They are not perfect transcripts, and historians warn that much was omitted, but they remain one of the richest windows into ordinary crime in London. What is striking, when you read cases of pocket-picking, is how often the victim's discovery begins with a gesture. I put my hand in my pocket. That is the moment. Not the theft itself, but the empty search afterward. The hand goes where the object should be, and the mind has to catch up with the fact that the world has changed. The phrase "from the person" mattered deeply in court because stealing directly from someone's body was treated as a serious offence. It carried a different emotional force from stealing an unattended object. A tankard taken from a tavern was theft. A handkerchief drawn from a pocket was intimate. The thief had crossed the invisible boundary around the body. He had come close enough to touch without permission, close enough to know what the victim carried, close enough to make the victim feel foolish afterward. That humiliation mattered. People who were robbed in this way often describe not only the missing object, but the push, the crowd, the suspicious closeness of another person. They were trying to reconstruct a moment they had failed to understand while it was happening. This is why Georgian Londoners watched each other so carefully in public. Suspicion became a kind of urban skill. A man who lingered too near a pocket could be challenged. A child who followed too closely might be seized. A woman in a crowd might be accused because she stood in the wrong place at the wrong second. Sometimes accusations were correct, sometimes they were not. The fear of theft did not make people fair-minded. It made them alert, anxious, and quick to call for help. The cry of "Stop thief" could turn strangers into a temporary mob. Men who had ignored one another moments before might join the chase. The thief ran not only from the victim, but from the sudden cooperation of the street. Still, the thief often had advantages. London's law enforcement before the creation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 was fragmented. Parish constables, night watchmen, beadles, magistrates and thief-takers all played roles. But this was not a unified professional police force patrolling the city in the modern way. London Lives describes 18th century policing as involving constables, ex-constables and thief-takers, with reforms driven by concern over property crime, especially robbery. That meant the first response to pickpocketing was often improvised. Catch the person now, or likely lose him. Find the stolen goods on him now, or he may deny everything. Locate witnesses now, while they still remember what they saw. The law could be harsh once it had a prisoner, but the street had to deliver the prisoner first. The best pickpockets knew how to prevent that. They did not always work alone. One person might jostle, another might lift. A third might receive the stolen item. The receiver could walk calmly away while the actual lifter remained empty-handed. If grabbed, he could turn out his pockets with theatrical innocence. This passing of property was not a clever flourish. It was a practical shield against conviction. A stolen watch in the thief's hand was dangerous. A stolen watch already 3 bodies away was much safer. Even children could be used in this chain because they were small, fast and often underestimated until it was too late. Clothing gave women thieves their own opportunities. A woman could move in a crowd with a different kind of cover, especially in markets or near shops where female presence was expected. Full skirts could hide movement. Aprons, shawls, baskets and bundles gave hands a reason to be busy. Some women stole directly, others acted as accomplices, others received goods. History has often preferred the image of the male street thief, perhaps because it fits a simpler picture of crime, but the records of urban theft do not belong to men alone. Poverty did not sort itself politely by gender. Women needed money, food, lodging, drink, protection, and bargaining power just as men did, and the street economy made room for any person willing or desperate enough to learn its rules. There was also a geography of temptation. The westward growth of fashionable London brought wealthy residents into new squares and streets, while the older city remained packed with trade, law, finance and retail. Between these zones moved servants, tradesmen, messengers, buyers, gamblers, sex workers, shoplifters, pickpockets, and people simply trying to cross town. Wealth and poverty were not sealed away from one another. They met constantly in thresholds, outside shops, at market stalls, near theatres, around taverns, at coach stands. The rich needed the labour of the poor, and the poor could not avoid the display of the rich. A gold watch was not just an object. It was a public fact about inequality, swinging from a waistcoat in a city where another person might not know where he would sleep that night. None of this means that every poor Londoner looked at every gentleman as prey. That would be lazy history and unfair to the thousands of ordinary people who worked honestly in brutal conditions. But it does mean the city placed desperation very close to portable wealth. It means a hungry boy could see money pass within inches of his hand. It means a woman behind on rent might know a receiver who would pay for stolen cloth. It means a man recently discharged from work might decide that a crowd outside a playhouse offered better odds than another day searching for employment. Crime does not become common only because people lack morals. It becomes common when opportunity, need, skill, and weak prevention meet often enough to form a habit. There is a small detail that helps explain why handkerchiefs appear so often in pickpocketing cases. A handkerchief was light, accessible, and easy to sell in quantity. It didn't require the same delicate removal as a watch, and unlike coins, it did not need to be found in a purse first. A gentleman might place it loosely in a coat pocket for use throughout the day. A thief could draw it out with 2 fingers and pass it away before the owner felt anything. To us, stealing a handkerchief may sound almost absurd, too small to risk a court case over. But in a world where cloth was valuable and where repeated small thefts could support a criminal network, the handkerchief was not trivial. It was the perfect beginner's prize, visible enough, light enough, common enough, and valuable enough to matter. The city's shops added another layer. Georgian London was full of goods displayed to attract the eye. Shop windows and open fronts invited desire. They also brought people to a halt, and a halted person in a moving street creates a pocket-picking opportunity. Someone pauses to look at ribbons, books, prints, silver, gloves, fans, or imported china. Others must move around them. The pause creates pressure from behind. The pressure creates contact. Contact creates doubt. Was that touch accidental? Was someone merely trying to pass? By the time the shopper decides to check, the thief may already be standing at another window, appearing just as interested in the goods as anyone else. This is one reason the city made people morally tired. It required constant interpretation. Every bump asked to be judged. Every stranger too near became a question. Every cry in the street might be business, distress, theatre, or trickery. A Londoner learned to look quickly and decide faster than comfort allowed. Modern city life still contains some of this, but Georgian London sharpened it. Without steady police protection, without modern lighting, without reliable identification, without cameras, without easy communication, the city depended heavily on human attention. And human attention fails. It fails when we are tired. It fails when we are entertained. It fails when we are embarrassed, rushed, drunk, flattered, hungry, angry, or curious. Pickpockets lived in those failures. By afternoon, the streets would have shifted again. Morning markets began to thin. Coffee houses filled and emptied. Courts and shops released men into taverns. Servants carried parcels back toward houses where they would be scolded if anything was missing. Children ran errands through lanes where older boys watched them. The theatres prepared for evening crowds. Lamps and link boys would later change the street's appearance without making it safe. Darkness did not end pickpocketing, it altered it. A thief needed less speed if the victim could not clearly see. But even in daylight, the city had its own darkness made from crowding, distraction, and speed. You could be robbed under a bright sky if enough bodies stood between you and certainty. Let us return for a moment to one ordinary person crossing the city. He is not rich. That matters. He is a clerk, perhaps, or a tradesman's assistant, or a country visitor who has come to London with careful instructions and a nervous hope that he will not look foolish. He carries a little money, a handkerchief, maybe a borrowed watch, because appearing respectable has its uses. He knows pickpockets exist. Everyone knows. He tells himself he will be careful. He keeps one hand near his coat. For a while, this works. Then the city begins doing what the city does. A cart blocks the way. A woman drops something. A boy laughs. A man curses. Someone asks him whether this is the way to Fleet Street. He turns. He answers. His hand leaves his coat for the length of a polite gesture. That is all the city needs from him. When he notices the loss, he may replay the last 5 minutes with painful clarity. The question from the stranger, the boy at his side, the push near the crossing, the moment he should have known. But the truth is that he could not know. not with certainty, not inside the pressure of that street. The pickpocket's real art was not taking the object. It was making the theft look like London. A bump that felt like crowding. A pause that felt like traffic. A question that felt like confusion. A child who felt like part of the scenery. The crime succeeded when it disappeared into ordinary life, and that is how every pocket became a prize. Not because every Londoner carried treasure, but because the city trained thieves to recognise that value was everywhere in small amounts. A city of 1 million people did not need every theft to be grand. It needed thousands of little chances. A handkerchief here, a purse there, a watch at the theatre, a buckle in a crowd, a coin from a servant, a packet from a messenger. A small object removed so quickly that the owner doubted his own senses. Georgian London was not conquered by pickpockets in one dramatic wave. It was worn down by repetition, by the daily fact that the street belonged to anyone quick enough to use it. Somewhere in that same city, a child was watching all of this before anyone thought to watch him. He saw which pockets men touched to reassure themselves. He saw how women reached for hidden purses. He saw how anger pulled a crowd one way while opportunity opened in another. He learned that adults noticed height, clothing, status, and noise, but often failed to notice a small hand at waist level. He learned that hunger made fear negotiable, and before long, if the wrong person took an interest in him, the street would stop being only a place where he wandered and become the place where he was trained. He is small enough to pass under an elbow without anyone turning their head. That is the first thing to understand about the child in the Georgian London crowd. Before he has a trade, before he has a room of his own, before he can sign his name with any confidence, before anyone in authority has decided whether he is a child to be pitied or a criminal to be feared, he has one advantage the city cannot help giving him. He is low to the ground, quick in the legs, hard to remember, and easy to overlook. In a street where men are watching other men, where shopkeepers are watching adult hands, where constables are watching faces they already know, the child moves in the gaps between everyone's attention. He's not invisible exactly. People see him. They see children everywhere. That is the point. A boy running with a basket, a boy lingering near a stall, a boy standing by a doorway, a boy following a gentleman too closely for a few steps, and then falling away again. Nothing about that is strange enough to stop the street, and that is where the training begins, not with a formal lesson, not with an older thief sitting a child down and explaining the trade as if it were a craft apprenticeship with rules and tools and a respectable master. It begins with watching. A hungry child watches more carefully than a comfortable adult. He watches hands. He watches where money goes after a purchase. He watches which pocket a man pats after leaving a tavern. He watches the way a woman reaches through the slit in her gown to find the pocket tied beneath her skirt. He watches the watch chain across a waistcoat and learns that if the chain is there, the watch is there too. He watches how crowds thicken at crossings, how people slow outside shop windows, how a seller's loud voice can pull every eye in one direction for half a second. The city becomes a schoolroom, and the lessons are not written on slates. They are written in movement. For many poor children in Georgian London, there was no reliable path into the kind of childhood we would recognise. Schooling existed, charity schools existed, apprenticeships existed, parish relief existed, and many children did pass through these systems in one form or another. But a national system of elementary education would not begin until the Education Act of 1870, and even that act did not settle compulsory attendance at once. Compulsory schooling followed later, with fees still a problem for poor families until the 1890s. In the 1700s, a child's daily life depended far more on family income, parish decisions, employment, charity, accident, illness, and luck than on any universal promise that childhood would be protected by school walls. So when we say children were trained to steal before they could read, we do not mean every poor child in London was a thief. That would be false, and it would be unfair to the thousands of children who worked honestly, carried goods, sold small wares, minded younger siblings, fetched water, swept crossings, entered service, or simply survived in families doing their best with very little. What we mean is that London had enough children without steady protection, enough children on the street for long hours, enough children without schooling that mattered, and enough adult criminals willing to use them, that a child could become skilled in theft before he ever became skilled in letters. The city did not need to corrupt all children. It only needed to fail enough of them. Think for a moment about what failure looked like at street level. A father dies. A mother takes in washing and cannot watch the older children all day. A boy is apprenticed to a master who beats him, underfeeds him, or simply turns him out when business is bad. A girl goes into service and loses her place. A child is born outside marriage and becomes a parish problem before he is old enough to understand the word parish. The old poor law placed responsibility for poor relief largely on local parishes, and London's parishes, charities, hospitals and workhouses created a complicated world of relief, discipline, apprenticeship and removal for the poor. Records from London Lives and related projects survive precisely because the city kept trying to manage paupers, vagrants and poor children as administrative problems. But a child is not an administrative problem to himself. He is cold, he is hungry, he is bored, he is frightened. He wants someone older to tell him what to do. And that is where the older boys and adult thieves enter the story. A child alone in London was vulnerable to honest work if he could get it, to charity if it reached him, to the workhouse if the parish claimed him, and to the criminal street if the wrong person noticed him first. The frightening thing is not that children chose crime in some clear adult way. The frightening thing is that crime could arrive as belonging. A boy who has no regular place may suddenly have companions. He may have older boys who know where to sleep, where to get food, where to sell a stolen handkerchief, which constable is slow, which alley has a back way out, which receiver pays less but asks fewer questions. What looks like corruption from outside may feel like rescue from within. There is a reason later literature remembered the child pickpocket so vividly. Dickens gave the 19th century the Artful Dodger, but the fear was older than Dickens. Daniel Defoe's Colonel Jack, published in 1722, had already imagined a boy drawn into bands of stealing children, and 18th century Londoners were familiar with the idea of roving boys who worked together around shops and pedestrians. Historians looking at the Old Bailey records have pointed to real groups of boys operating in London, not always as fixed gangs in the modern sense, but as loose networks of young thieves who cooperated, betrayed each other when frightened, and depended on adult receivers who bought what they stole. One of the clearest examples comes from 1737, when Old Bailey proceedings described a group of 7 or 8 boys connected to an adult receiver named Nicholas Carell. The boys stole goods from shops and passers-by, and then sold the stolen property to Carell, who functioned as the adult link between childish theft and the market where stolen goods became money. This matters because it shows the structure behind the child's hand. The boy might be the one small enough to slip through the door, lift the cloth, or take the item, but the boy was not the whole machine. There had to be someone to teach him, someone to encourage him, someone to buy the goods, and someone to make him believe that the next theft would be worth the danger. Let us sit with that adult receiver for a moment, because he is one of the ugliest figures in this story. The child thief is easy to condemn if you stop the story at the stolen object, but behind him is often someone older who understands value far better than he does. A boy might steal stockings, cloth, ribbons, small metal goods, or a handkerchief, and know only that it can be exchanged for food, gin, lodging, or a few coins. The receiver knows the market. The receiver knows who will buy. The receiver knows which stolen item can be resold openly, which must be hidden, which can be altered, which is too dangerous to keep. The receiver turns a child's risk into adult profit, and if the law closes in, the child's body is the one most easily seized. There is something particularly hard to hear in the way these boys learned cooperation. They were trained not only to steal, but to steal in sequence. One boy watches, one boy blocks, one boy distracts, one boy reaches, one boy carries the goods away. A lone child might be quick, but a group could create confusion. They could crowd a victim, run in different directions, pass the object from hand to hand, and turn the simple question of guilt into a problem no witness could answer cleanly. If a stolen handkerchief was found on a boy, the case was easier. If the handkerchief vanished into another child's sleeve, then into a lodging house, then into the hands of a receiver, the street had done its work. This is why the training had to include more than fingers. A child had to learn courage, or at least the appearance of it. He had to learn how close he could stand without provoking a reaction. He had to learn how to be jostled without looking guilty, how to run without running too early, how to look stupid when questioned, how to cry if crying helped, how to deny without over-explaining, how to blame another boy, how to endure a beating, and how to keep his face blank when a stolen object was passed to him. These are terrible skills for a child to have, and yet in that world, for some children, they were practical skills. The city did not ask whether the lesson was moral, it asked whether the child ate. The law's view of these children was complicated and often brutal. The modern idea of a separate juvenile justice system did not yet exist in the form we know today. In the 18th century, children could be tried under the same criminal law as adults. Children under 7 were generally treated as incapable of felony because they were not considered able to know right from wrong, while by 14 they could be treated as fully criminally responsible. Between those ages, courts had to judge capacity and guilt in a grey area that left children exposed to severe punishment. That meant a child could be pitied one moment and sentenced the next. Mercy existed, but it was uneven. A small body did not guarantee a small punishment. Court records from the late Georgian and early post-Georgian period show boys receiving sentences that now seem almost impossible when set beside their ages. In 1819, John Henley, age 14, was found guilty of pocket picking and sentenced to transportation for life. In 1820, 2 boys aged 13 and 14 were convicted in a pocket-picking case and sentenced to transportation for life. In 1822, 12-year-old George Roberts was found guilty of pocket-picking, recommended to mercy and whipped. These cases come slightly late in the long Georgian world, but they show the harsh legal climate into which child pickpockets could fall. The same society that treated children as morally unfinished could punish them as if they had finished becoming criminals. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to turn these boys into symbols and stop seeing them as children. The court records do that often enough. They give us names, ages, charges, verdicts and sentences, but rarely the morning before the theft, rarely the hunger, rarely the adult who first told the boy he could earn more in an hour with his fingers than in a week of honest errands, rarely the room where he slept, rarely the fear he felt when someone grabbed his collar, rarely the way he might have tried to look hard in front of older boys because softness was dangerous. The law needed to decide guilty or not guilty. The street had already made him many other things before that decision was reached. Imagine one of these boys at the edge of Covent Garden. He's perhaps 9 or 10. He may not know his exact age. That is another detail modern people forget. Age was not always a clean fact in the lives of the poor. Birth records existed, baptisms existed, but street children did not always carry certainty about themselves. He has a coat too large for him, not because someone bought it with growth in mind, but because it belonged to someone else first. His shoes are bad, his hands are dirty. He knows which stalls are watched and which are not. He knows that women buying food are harder to rob when they are alone, but easier when they are arguing over price. He knows that country visitors stare too long. He knows that a man who has been drinking turns slowly. He knows that if someone cries out, he must not always run. Sometimes running is confession. Sometimes the safest thing is to look toward the cry like everyone else. Who taught him that? Maybe an older brother. Maybe a boy in a lodging house. Maybe a woman who sold stolen goods. Maybe an adult thief who fed him once and then made the feeding conditional. Maybe no one taught him in words at all. Maybe he watched, imitated, failed, was slapped for failing, tried again, and discovered that the world rewarded quick improvement. That is how many practical skills are learned by the poor in any age. Not through instruction first, but through consequence. There was also play in it, and that may be the most unsettling part. Children do not stop being children because they are in danger. They joke, they compete, they show off, they dare one another. They turn fear into performance because fear is easier to bear when someone laughs. In the 1737 case involving the boy gang and receiver, one account described boys greeting another imprisoned boy with rough joking about his irons, language that the adult observer took as shamelessness, but that a modern reader might recognise as bravado under pressure. Think about that for a second. A child in fetters, laughing because the alternative is to understand fully where he is. That is not innocence exactly, but it is not adult hardness either. It is childhood trying to survive in a place built to grind it down. The training of a child pickpocket also depended on the city's moral confusion about children themselves. In polite writing, children could be objects of charity, souls to be saved, apprentices to be disciplined, or little sinners to be corrected. In the street they could be labourers, beggars, nuisances, messengers, thieves, victims, or witnesses, sometimes all within the same week. A small boy might be pitied if he begged at a church door, chased if he lingered near a shop, used if he could steal, beaten if he was caught, and then described in court as if he had acted with full adult intention. There was no single category that protected him. He moved between pity and punishment depending on who was looking. Girls were part of this world too, though the image of the boy pickpocket has always been stronger. A girl in the street could steal, carry, distract, receive, or work with older women. She might be sent into shops because shopkeepers expected female customers. She might be used in crowds because people watched boys more sharply in certain spaces. She might enter theft through domestic service, prostitution, lodging house networks, or simple hunger. But girls often vanish faster in the records because accusations against them were tangled with assumptions about sexuality, disorder, and reputation. A poor girl on the street was judged before she touched a pocket. Her danger was not only the law, it was the speed with which society could decide what kind of girl she must be. The children who learned pocket-picking learned the value of objects with a speed that should make us uncomfortable. A handkerchief was not just a handkerchief. It was linen, perhaps silk, perhaps marked with initials, perhaps worth enough to matter in court. A watch was not just a watch. It was metal, mechanism, status, and money. Buckles could be removed, ribbons could be sold, cloth could be cut down, a purse could be emptied and discarded. A child who had never been taught arithmetic formally could still learn the arithmetic of theft. This many handkerchiefs for a meal. This kind of watch too dangerous unless passed quickly. This receiver cheats but pays at once. This stolen item must not be carried near the place it was taken. That is education of a kind, though a bitter one. And just as in any education, there were stages. The youngest might begin with errands, lookout work, carrying messages, or hovering near older boys. Then perhaps he's asked to take something easy from a stall. Then a handkerchief from a pocket with another boy shielding him. Then a purse. Then a watch. Each success makes the next attempt more likely. Each failure teaches a lesson. A beating teaches where not to stand. A chase teaches which alley is too narrow, which wall can be climbed, which door is usually unlatched. A court appearance teaches what names to give and what names not to give. A sentence passed on another boy teaches fear, but fear does not always stop crime. Sometimes fear only teaches speed. This is where the adult world's response could make things worse. A child caught stealing might be whipped, imprisoned, transported, or thrown into contact with older criminals. The intention might be correction, deterrence, discipline, or public safety. But a prison or holding place could also function as another school. A boy who entered knowing how to lift a handkerchief might leave knowing how to sell a watch, forge a story, or find a receiver in another district. The law could punish the child for belonging to the criminal world while giving him more access to that world. That contradiction was not unique to Georgian London, but Georgian London displayed it with painful clarity. It is worth remembering that the children themselves did not necessarily think of what they were doing in the same categories adults used. A magistrate saw theft, a moralist saw vice, a victim saw violation, a receiver saw profit. A boy might see a dare, a meal, a debt, a habit, a way to impress someone, or simply the thing he had been told to do. This does not make the theft harmless. It does not erase the victim, but it changes the emotional shape of the crime. The child's hand at the pocket may be doing adult damage before the child has an adult understanding of what damage means. There is a moment I keep returning to in my mind. Not the theft itself, but the second before it. A boy standing close enough to a gentleman to smell wool, tobacco, sweat, and the faint powder from his wig. The boy knows the watch is there. He can see the chain. He knows another boy is waiting a few steps behind him. He knows if he fails, he may be seized. He knows if he succeeds, the object will be gone from his own hand almost immediately. His fingers are ready. His face must show nothing. Around him, London is making all the noises London makes. Wheels, bells, voices, hooves, cellars, laughter, curses. No one is looking at him in the right way. That is his opening. For 1 second, his whole life narrows to cloth, chain, timing, and nerve. This is the part that makes the title of this story feel less like exaggeration than it should. Before he could read a printed sentence, a child could learn to read a crowd. Before he could write his name, he could learn to write a route through alleys in his memory. Before he could count properly on paper, he could count the seconds between a shove and a cry. Before a teacher could place a book in his hands, an older thief could place a stolen handkerchief there and tell him to run it to a receiver. The tragedy is not only that children stole, the tragedy is that the city offered them a curriculum, and the first lessons were hunger, watching, speed, denial, and fear. By evening, that same child might be back in a lodging house, under a stall near a tavern door, or in the company of boys who were half friends and half rivals. The day's takings would be divided badly, because they almost always were. Someone older would take the best share, someone younger would be cheated, someone would boast, someone would be silent because he had seen another boy caught, and tomorrow the city would open again with the same markets, the same crossings, the same shop windows, the same theatres, the same visitors who did not yet know how close to hold their coats. The child would go back into the crowd with more knowledge than yesterday, and that knowledge would move from his eyes into his hands until the act became almost too quick to see. How those hands worked, how a body could be searched by touch in a moving crowd, how distraction became technique, and how several thieves could make one theft look like an accident, is where the street begins to show its real machinery. The first mistake is thinking the pickpockets' work began with the hand. It did not. The hand came late. By the time the fingers moved, most of the theft had already happened in the mind. The thief had chosen the street, read the crowd, studied the victim, noticed the clothing, understood the movement around him, and waited for that brief little tear in attention that every person leaves open sooner or later. We tend to imagine pickpocketing as a sudden act, a quick snatch, a little flick of the wrist, and then a boy running away down an alley. Sometimes it was that crude. Sometimes a thief was desperate or drunk or young enough to be foolish, and he simply reached where he should not have reached. But the better pickpockets of Georgian London did something quieter than that. They made the city do half the work for them. That is what I want you to sit with for a moment. The pickpocket did not need to create chaos in London. London already had it waiting. The thief only had to understand where to stand inside it. A market stall created one kind of distraction. A theatre door created another. A street crossing made a person pause. A shop window made a person look sideways. A coach wheel stuck in mud made everyone turn toward the noise. A quarrel made a little circle of watchers. A sermon ending made a crowd press through a church door. A public execution made thousands of people raise their eyes toward the scaffold. The pickpockets method was not separate from the city. It was woven into the city's habits so closely that, at its best, the theft looked like nothing more than ordinary London pressing against ordinary London. The Old Bailey proceedings, the published accounts of trials at London's Central Criminal Court, preserve thousands of small moments where victims tried to explain how something vanished from their person. These records are not perfect word-for-word transcripts, but they give names, offences, verdicts, sentences, and often pieces of witness testimony that let us see the mechanics of street crime with unusual sharpness. The details are repetitive in a way that becomes revealing. A man is in a crowd. A woman feels a push. Someone notices a boy's hand. A handkerchief is missing. A watch is gone. The accused is seized. Sometimes the stolen item is found. Sometimes it has already disappeared. The theft itself is often over before the victim understands that anything has begun. So let us not picture one thief at first. Picture three. Not because every theft required a group, but because the group shows the method more honestly. One is the watcher. He stands slightly away from the victim and reads the movement. He's not looking at the pocket every second because staring is dangerous. He's looking at the person as a whole. How does the coat hang? Which side does the hand return to? Does the man carry himself like a Londoner, or like someone newly arrived and trying not to look newly arrived? Is he drunk? Is he angry? Is he distracted by a companion? Is he proud of his watch chain? Is he nervous enough to keep touching his purse, and by touching it, showing everyone exactly where it is? The watcher is not idle. He's doing the thinking. The second is the maker of opportunity. He may bump, delay, ask a question, drop something, laugh too loudly, quarrel, block the way, or simply become part of the pressure of the crowd. What matters is not drama. Drama can be dangerous. What matters is plausibility. The touch must feel like the street itself. Georgian London was crowded enough that bodies collided constantly. A shoulder against a shoulder did not automatically mean crime. A person stepping too close could be rude, hurried, drunk, or simply trapped by traffic. That uncertainty was useful. It gave the thief a small shelter inside the victim's doubt. If the victim is not sure whether to be alarmed, he often loses the second in which alarm would help. The third is the hand. The hand does not need to be strong. It needs to be controlled. It needs to move at the moment when the victim's attention has already gone elsewhere. It needs to take only what can be taken cleanly, because greed ruins this kind of work. A clumsy thief pulls at too much. A frightened thief snatches too suddenly. A greedy thief lingers. The skilled pickpocket understands that the whole crime may depend on touching cloth lightly enough that the touch feels like nothing, or feels like the crowd, or feels like a brush of fabric from another passer-by. In the Canton slang of the period, pickpocketing had its own vocabulary. To go pickpocketing might be called going on the buzzcloak, or filing the cly, and different specialists were described by different terms, including those associated with drawing handkerchiefs, purses, or other small objects. The language itself tells us that this was not a single careless act in the popular imagination, but a recognised street trade with roles, techniques and reputations. But the most important part happens next, because a stolen object is dangerous while it is still near the hand that stole it. If the victim cries out and the thief is caught with the goods on him, the story is much simpler for the court. If the goods have been passed away, everything becomes harder. This is why groups mattered. A handkerchief, a purse, a watch, or a small case might move from the lifter to another person almost immediately. The first thief could then appear empty-handed. He could protest. He could turn out his pockets. He could look injured by the accusation. The stolen object might already be with a child, a woman, an older accomplice, or someone calmly leaving the scene as if nothing at all has happened. The law wanted evidence. The street specialised in making evidence travel. There is a famous kind of disappointment in these records, and you can feel it even through the dry language of trial reporting. A victim knows he had the object. He knows he lost it in the crowd. Someone saw a suspicious movement. Someone grabbed the accused. Yet somehow the thing itself is gone, and without the thing, the case becomes thinner. Not always lost, but thinner. The pickpockets' method depended on that thinness. It depended on making the truth obvious to the victim and difficult to prove to everyone else. The handkerchief was one of the great objects of this world. That may sound strange to us, because today a handkerchief feels old-fashioned and small, and a paper tissue feels almost worthless. But in Georgian London, a good handkerchief could be linen, cotton, silk, plain, patterned, imported, marked, fine enough to resell, and useful enough to steal repeatedly. Many Old Bailey cases concern handkerchiefs taken from the person, often valued at a few shillings, which was not nothing to an ordinary household. In one 1818 case, John Dix was charged with stealing a handkerchief valued at 2 shillings from John Gunn's person. In a 1790 case, George Bowyer was indicted for stealing a pocket handkerchief valued at 2 shillings from Claude Crispigny. The repetition of these cases reminds us that the handkerchief was not a comic prize. It was portable value. The theft of a handkerchief required less violence than a robbery, less preparation than burglary, and less exposure than shoplifting. It also taught beginners the grammar of the trade. The thief learned distance. He learned timing. He learned how fabric responds. He learned how easily a person notices pressure in one place but not another. He learned how a body shifts when distracted. He learned how to take something small enough to hide but valuable enough to sell. A child could begin there because the handkerchief sat close to the edge of public life. It belonged to the private body, but it was often carried in a way that made it almost visible. It was personal and exposed at the same time, which is exactly the kind of object a pickpocket prefers. Watches were different. A watch was heavier, more valuable, and more dangerous. A gentleman's watch was often attached by a chain, and that chain could be both advertisement and obstacle. It announced the presence of the watch, but it also required a more careful theft. The watch mattered not only because of its value, but because of what it said about the owner. Timekeeping was status. A man who wore a watch carried with him a small machine that declared order, punctuality, money, and social rank. For the thief, that made the watch tempting. For the victim, losing it was more than inconvenience. It was humiliation. To have one's watch lifted from the body was to be made ridiculous in public. To discover that the orderly gentleman had failed to manage the most basic boundary around himself. The method around a watch often relied on pressure. Not a blow, not a fight. Pressure. A crowd narrowing at a doorway, a shove at the edge of a market, a moment when a man's arms are engaged, perhaps adjusting his coat, perhaps steadying himself after being jostled. The thief needed the owner's body to be busy. A body that is busy in one place becomes less aware in another. This is not a modern instruction. It is an old human weakness. The mind cannot attend equally to everything at once. Georgian pickpockets understood that without needing the language of psychology. They learned it by trial, fear, and repetition. Distraction could be loud or quiet. Loud distraction was the cry, the argument, the dropped bundle, the staged quarrel, the sudden movement that pulled heads around. Quiet distraction was subtler. A question asked with urgency. A child appearing lost. A person blocking a path just long enough to make the victim adjust course. A companion engaging the victim in conversation while someone else worked at the side. The key was not always to make the victim look far away. Sometimes it was enough to make him think about something else while his eyes remained near the scene. People can look directly ahead and still fail to notice what matters. Anyone who has ever searched for something already in their hand knows this. And then there is the crowd itself, the greatest accomplice of all. A crowd changes the rules of touch. In an empty street, a stranger's hand near your coat is alarming. In a packed street, contact becomes ordinary. You expect to be brushed. You expect to be nudged. You expect someone's sleeve against yours, a basket at your hip, a shoulder too close, a child slipping between adults. The pickpocket hid inside that expectation. The crowd gave him excuses in advance. It also gave him escape. Once the object was taken, the thief did not need to outrun one man across an open field. He needed to become difficult to distinguish from everyone else. A hat turned down, a coat changed, a corner taken, a stolen item passed, and certainty began to dissolve. This is why the pickpocket's work required an intimate knowledge of pedestrian traffic. Modern historians studying later 19th century cases have emphasised how pickpockets understood the behaviour of the street crowd, and the same principle belongs strongly to Georgian London. Pickpocketing was not simply about dexterous fingers. It was about knowing how people moved through urban space, where they slowed, where they bunched together, and where their attention naturally shifted. A thief who could not read a crowd was like a sailor who could not read water. He might survive by luck for a while, but he did not understand the element he worked in. Let us place ourselves at the entrance to a theatre as the doors open. It is evening. The air is damp. Coach wheels grind against the street. People in better clothes than usual gather with the small impatience of those who have paid to be entertained and do not want to wait. There is talk, laughter, irritation, greetings, servants trying to clear the way, ticket handling, and the repeated narrowing of many bodies through limited space. No one wants to look frightened. That matters. Respectable people do not wish to clutch themselves like fools in public, especially not when they are dressed to be seen. The pickpocket benefits from vanity as much as distraction. A man who will not guard his pocket because guarding it looks nervous has already given something away. The thief at the theatre door does not need every person in the crowd. He needs one. A man reaching for a ticket, a woman turning to answer a friend, a visitor dazzled by the lights, a gentleman irritated at being pushed and looking behind him at the wrong person. The crowd surges, the body opens, the hand moves. Then the thief's face becomes as blank as everyone else's. That blankness is part of the method. A guilty face is as dangerous as stolen goods. The good pickpocket does not look triumphant. He looks bored, inconvenienced, mildly annoyed by the same crowd that is helping him. At a market, the method changes slightly. Markets are built from exchange. Hands are already moving everywhere. Coins are counted. Goods are lifted, inspected, rejected, wrapped, carried, and argued over. A thief can hide his own movement among legitimate movements. If everyone is reaching, one more reaching hand does not stand out in the same way. There is also the matter of sound. A market is not just noisy. It is layered. Sellers cry. Buyers dispute. Animals complain. Wheels pass. Metal strikes wood. Someone laughs. Someone curses. If a victim feels something and says, "What was that?" the answer may be lost before it forms. The noise protects the thief from the victim's hesitation. A church crowd works differently again. The theft there often benefits from transition. People are entering or leaving. They're adjusting from one mode of behaviour to another. Before service, they may be solemn, focused, concerned with propriety. After service, they become social. They greet, bow, talk, look for carriages, gather children, and discuss the sermon or the weather. The mind shifting from worship to social life is momentarily full. The doorway compresses the congregation. A pickpocket can use that compression. It is almost indecently practical, but theft is often indecently practical. It goes where people gather, not where morality says it should stay away. What is striking is how often the victim only discovers the theft because someone else sees it. A bystander, a constable, a watchful shopkeeper, or even another thief may notice the hand. In several Old Bailey cases, The person whose property was stolen did not immediately know anything had happened until warned by someone nearby. That detail is important. The method worked precisely because sensation failed. A man could have a handkerchief taken from his pocket and remain unaware until a witness told him. The body, which we imagine as the first guardian of property, could be fooled. This is why so much depended on trained observation, both among thieves and those trying to catch them. Constables, thief-takers, and later Bow Street officers often watched known pickpockets in crowds. They recognised repeated behaviour. The same boy lingering near the same sort of victim, the same man following too closely at a fair, the same gesture toward a pocket. London's policing in the 18th century was fragmented, involving constables, watchmen, thief-takers, and magistrates rather than a single modern police force. But those who knew the streets developed their own forms of surveillance. The pickpocket and the thief-taker were both students of movement. One studied how to steal. The other studied how theft looked just before it happened. There is a strange intimacy in this. The pickpocket's method required attention to people who would never willingly grant it. He had to know how a gentleman carried himself after drink, how a servant balanced a bundle when tired, how a woman protected a pocket under her gown, how a sailor moved after wages had been paid, how a country visitor paused too often, how embarrassment changed posture, how fear made a hand return again and again to the hidden purse. It was a predatory form of knowledge, but it was knowledge all the same. The thief watched the city more carefully than most respectable people did. Now, we should not romanticize the skill too much. There were failed attempts everywhere. The Old Bailey records are full of defendants caught by witnesses, seized immediately, found with goods, identified by victims or betrayed by accomplices. A hand caught in a pocket left little room for poetry. A stolen handkerchief found under a coat could turn a boy's bravado into terror. A watch recovered from a receiver could pull more people into court. The method was clever only when it worked, and it did not always work. But enough attempts succeeded to make the fear constant. Enough victims lost enough objects that the pickpocket became one of the familiar figures of metropolitan danger. The penalties made the risk almost hard to comprehend. In the 18th century, English criminal law could treat property offences with extraordinary severity, and pickpocketing could be a capital offence depending on the legal framing and value involved. Transportation, imprisonment, whipping, and death all stood somewhere in the shadow of the court, even when juries, judges, or pardons softened the final outcome. The Old Bailey's own historical material explains the wide range of punishments used from the late 17th century onward, and the digital panopticon's work on punishment shows how transportation became a major sentence for convicts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That means every practiced movement of the pickpocket's hand carried consequences far beyond the value of the object itself. A 2-shilling handkerchief could open the door to a fate that no 2-shilling object could possibly be worth in any rational sense. And still the hand moved. That tells us something about risk, but it also tells us something about the people taking it. Some were hardened, some were foolish, some were desperate. Some were children trained by adults who expected them to absorb the danger. Some had learned that the fear of tomorrow was easier to ignore than the hunger of tonight. A modern person can say, quite reasonably, that the risk was absurd, but risk looks different when the alternatives are thin. The pickpocket did not always ask whether theft was worth transportation or the gallows. He asked whether he could get through the day. Those are not the same question. There is another piece of the method that does not involve the theft itself, and that is choosing what not to steal. A skilled thief could not simply take whatever shone brightest. Some objects were too identifiable, some victims were too alert, some crowds were too watched, some streets offered poor escape, some goods were hard to sell, some receivers were unreliable. Some accomplices were careless. The city tempted, but it also punished mistakes. The pickpocket's survival depended on restraint as much as boldness. The young thief had to learn that not every pocket was a prize worth reaching for, even in a city where every pocket looked like one. The best moment for a pickpocket was often not when the victim was alone, but when the victim believed everyone was equally distracted. This is what made public spectacles so useful. At a fair, a performance gathers attention. At an execution, the scaffold gathers attention. At a street fight, anger gathers attention. At a royal procession, status gathers attention. Human beings look together. We are social creatures before we are careful ones. When everyone looks in the same direction, the person who looks elsewhere gains power. That is the pickpocket's advantage. He is not interested in the spectacle. He is interested in the watchers. Think about that the next time you imagine a Georgian crowd gathered around something dramatic. The real story may not be only at the centre. The hanging, the actor, the preacher, the quarrel, the puppet show, the animal, the auction, the singer, the procession, these are the obvious events. Around them is another event, quieter and more efficient. People being studied, pockets being judged, goods moving from person to person, a victim laughing at a joke while his handkerchief leaves him, a man applauding on one side of the crowd while his watch is already being carried away on the other. History often tells us what the crowd came to see. Crime records tell us what the crowd failed to notice. By late evening, the goods taken during the day had to go somewhere. A handkerchief might be bundled with others. A watch might be altered, broken down, or carried to someone who knew how to move it. Coins were simplest, because coins lost their story as soon as they changed hands. Objects with marks were more dangerous. Initials, seals, recognisable patterns, unusual workmanship, all of these could betray a thief if found. The method therefore extended beyond the street into rooms, taverns, lodging houses, shops, and hidden arrangements where stolen property could be converted into something safer. The theft was only the visible edge of the operation. Behind it stood receivers, buyers, and the everyday hunger of an illicit market. For the victim, though, the story remained painfully simple. Something had been there, then it was not. That emptiness is the emotional centre of pickpocketing, not the chase, not the trial, not even the punishment. The empty pocket, the little moment when the hand searches twice because the mind refuses the first answer. The coat is patted again, the waistcoat is checked, the purse string is felt, the body turns, as if the missing object might be floating somewhere behind it. Then comes the heat of embarrassment, the anger, the sudden desire to remember every face nearby. But memory is a poor tool in a crowd. The thief has counted on that. And so the method, when reduced to its simplest truth, was not fingers alone. It was a sequence of human weaknesses arranged in the right order. Attention can be pulled, bodies can be crowded, pride can be used, clothing can betray what it hides, fear can arrive late, evidence can be passed away, witnesses can disagree, the city can swallow a person who knows how to move with it. Georgian London did not invent these weaknesses, but it gathered them densely enough that a skilled pickpocket could make a living from them. As the night deepened and the crowds shifted from markets to taverns, from shops to theatres, from churchyards to alleys, these same principles followed them. The method changed its clothing depending on the place, but the foundations remained. Watch, wait, distract, take, pass, disappear. Not as a clean little formula, because real streets were messy and dangerous, but as a pattern repeated often enough that Londoners learned to fear it. The next thing to understand is where the pattern worked best, because Georgian London had places that seemed almost built for the thief's hand. Markets where everyone reached at once, theatres where vanity lowered caution, churches where crowds gathered in moral seriousness, and public spectacles where thousands of eyes looked toward one thing while the pickpocket looked toward everything else. The places that frightened Londoners most were not always the dark alleys. That is the first thing to correct in the imagination. The alley mattered, of course. The unlit passage, the narrow court, the doorway half hidden behind a projecting sign, the lane where a person could be followed after dark and no one respectable wished to look too closely. Those places had their own danger. But the pickpocket did not need loneliness in order to work. In fact, loneliness could be inconvenient. A lone victim had too much room to feel a strange hand. A lone victim could turn quickly and see who stood behind him. A lone victim might remember the only other person in the street. The pickpocket's best friend was not emptiness. It was company. Too much company. The kind of crowd where everyone is close enough to touch and no one is close enough to trust. This is why the busiest parts of Georgian London became the most useful hunting grounds. The thief did not have to drag a person out of public life. He waited until public life became dense enough to hide him. Markets, theatres, churches, fairs, pleasure gardens, public punishments, coach stands, bridges, shop fronts, tavern doors, and the great bottlenecks of the city all offer the same basic gift. Bodies pressed together under some reason that made the pressure seem normal. A person who feels a touch in an empty room is alarmed. A person who feels a touch while being squeezed through a theatre entrance thinks only that London is crowded. That little difference, that tiny delay before suspicion, was worth more to a thief than darkness. Let us begin in the market, because the market was one of the most honest places in the city and one of the easiest places to rob. That sounds contradictory, but it is not. A market was built on attention divided into too many small pieces. The buyer looked at the fish, then the price, then the seller's face, then the coin in the hand, then the basket, then the mud underfoot, then the elbow of another buyer who had pushed too close. The seller watched the goods, the buyer's money, the stall next door, the cart arriving late, the apprentice who might be lazy, the constable passing through, and the weather that could spoil everything before noon. No one in a market was truly still. Even standing in one place, people were reaching, lifting, testing, weighing, bargaining, and turning. A hand moving near cloth or coin did not immediately look like a criminal hand. It looked like part of the market. Covent Garden is useful to picture here because it gathered several temptations into one neighbourhood. It had its market, its theatres, its taverns, its sex trade, its coffee houses, its passages, its visitors, and its constant mixing of people who had money with people who badly needed it. Later accounts of the Georgian underworld repeatedly associate places such as the Strand, the Exchange, Drury Lane and Covent Garden with pickpockets, and the area around Covent Garden in particular carried a reputation for petty criminals because its market and theatres kept crowds moving through it at different hours of the day and night. Picture Covent Garden early enough that the day is still practical rather than fashionable. The market is awake. Carts have come in. Women are buying for households where someone else will complain if the greens are poor or the fish is old. Servants have errands that must be finished quickly. Porters move through with loads that make them impatient with everyone in their path. A gentleman may pass through because London's districts were not sealed away from one another, and the wealthy were constantly being pulled through spaces where they could be watched by the poor. A pickpocket does not need to be dramatic here. He can stand with an expression of mild boredom near a stall, as if waiting for someone. He can hold a basket he does not intend to fill. He can look young enough to be dismissed, or old enough to be assumed about some ordinary business. Then he waits for the small confusion that markets create every few seconds. The market offered one of the simplest tricks in the pickpocket's world, the false accident. A basket knocks a hip, a shoulder presses a sleeve. A body leans in to inspect something and forces another body to shift. In that shift, a pocket opens to the street. If the victim is a man, perhaps the thief aims at a coat pocket or a waistcoat pocket. If the victim is a woman, the thief may be watching for the slit in the gown that leads to the pocket tied around the waist underneath. If there is a purse, it may not be visible, but the movement toward it is visible. People reveal what they protect by checking it. A woman who reaches for her pocket after a purchase is given a lesson to anyone watching carefully. She may believe she has reassured herself, and she has. But she has also marked the place. Now, the market was not only useful because people carried money there. It was useful because goods themselves confused value. Cloth, Ribbons, buckles, handkerchiefs, small tools, packets, food and coins moved constantly between people. A stolen item could vanish into legitimate trade almost immediately. If a handkerchief was lifted in the crush, it could be folded into a bundle with others. If coins were taken, they lost their story as soon as they passed from one palm to another. If a small object was dropped into a basket, the basket itself became an alibi. The market did not simply provide victims, it provided cover after the theft, a way for stolen property to look like property that had always belonged to the person carrying it. The records of London crime help explain why these ordinary settings mattered so much. Property crime dominated the business of the Old Bailey, London's principal criminal court, and by the second quarter of the 18th century, the judges could expect to deal with hundreds of accused people charged with property offences each year. That does not mean every theft was prosecuted, because many were not, and minor losses could disappear into silence, frustration, or private settlement. It means that the court records show only the visible edge of a much larger problem that Londoners felt in their daily movements. From the market, move toward the theatre as evening begins to gather. The same city changes its clothing, but not its habits. The day's bargaining gives way to entertainment. People who are careful in the morning become eager in the evening. They have paid for a performance, or they hope to be seen at one. Outside Drury Lane or Covent Garden Theatre, the crowd thickens with a different quality. There is less practical suspicion and more vanity. Coats are brushed, gloves are adjusted, watches are worn visibly. A woman's dress might be arranged to show taste, money, or aspiration. A man who has spent effort appearing respectable does not want to clutch his pocket like a frightened fool in front of strangers. That pride is not a moral failing, it is human. But the pickpocket could use it. The theatre entrance was close to perfect, because it forced many bodies through limited space. Doorways are among the thief's most useful inventions, though architects did not mean them that way. A doorway slows a crowd and compresses it. People stop, search for tickets, speak to attendants, look for companions, hesitate, turn sideways, and become irritated by the pressure behind them. If a person is pushed in that moment, he may blame the people behind him. The narrow door, the doorkeeper, the general inconvenience of the city, anything except the precise hand that has just used the pressure to take what it wanted. In January 1764, according to Richter Norton's account of the Georgian underworld, Sir John Fielding's mounted patrols caught 9 pickpockets preparing to work the crowds, coming out of theatres in Covent Garden, which tells us how predictable those theatre crowds had become as opportunities for thieves. It is worth staying with that word, preparing. Pickpockets did not simply wander hopefully wherever people gathered. The good ones chose the hour. They knew the beginning of a performance was one opportunity, because people were eager and pressing inward. They knew the end was another, because people came out talking, laughing, arguing about the play, looking for coaches, searching for servants, adjusting to the night air, and often thinking less clearly than when they entered. The exit crowd was tired, warm, possibly drunk, socially distracted and impatient to get home. A person leaving a theatre is often still half inside the performance. The mind lingers on the stage while the body enters the street. That little gap between imagination and pavement was useful. There was also the matter of class mixing. Theatres brought together different ranks under the same roof, though not always in the same seats. The pit, boxes and gallery carried their own social meanings, and outside the building those divisions had to pass through shared doors, streets and coach stands. Pickpockets understood that a theatre produced a brief public sorting of people by dress, money and habit. A thief could see who had come in a private carriage, who had paid for better places, who had been drinking, who was new to the city, who had servants, who had no servant but dressed as if he wished he did. The theatre did not merely entertain London. It displayed London to anyone skilled enough to read it. The pleasure gardens offered another version of the same problem. Vauxhall and Cupid's were famous places of entertainment, with music, walks, food, lamps, flirtation, and crowds that crossed lines of status more freely than many moralists liked. Contemporary and later accounts describe Vauxhall and Cupars as favoured hunting grounds for pickpockets, and the very features that made them attractive to visitors made them attractive to thieves. Admission crowds, lit walks beside darker corners, music to gather attention, and enough movement that one person could approach another without immediately seeming suspicious. A pleasure garden after dark deserves a moment of honest attention. It was not simply a pretty place with lamps. It was a managed public fantasy, a place where people paid to feel themselves part of a fashionable world. Lamps made things visible without making them fully secure. Music created direction for the eyes and ears. Walks allowed people to move, pause, flirt, watch, and be watched. Where there is flirtation, there is lowered attention. Where there is display, there is property. Where there are darker walks just beyond the respectable glow, there is room for confusion. In 1763, Vauxhall's darker walks were reportedly closed by order of magistrates, and then reopened after lighting was improved, which is a small reminder that even entertainment spaces had to negotiate between pleasure and disorder. Churches seem as if they should belong to another part of the story, but they do not. The pickpocket followed gatherings, not principles. A church door after service could be as useful as a theatre door after a performance, though the mood was different. People leaving worship were not applauding or laughing. They were speaking quietly, greeting neighbours, managing children, looking for relatives, finding carriages, adjusting cloaks, and returning from religious attention to social attention. That change matters. The moment after a shared ritual often produces softness in the crowd. People feel they have done something orderly. They may be less ready to suspect disorder at the edge of it. There is also a practical reason church crowds worked. They were regular. A thief could learn the timing. He could know which parish drew wealthier worshippers, which doors narrowed most sharply, where a person might pause to speak, where the street opened, where an accomplice could stand, and where a stolen object could be passed away. Respectability itself could become cover. A person near a church might not be assumed criminal unless he already looked criminal, and the clever thief tried very hard not to look like the idea people had in their heads. The best disguise in London was often not a costume. It was ordinariness. Now add the fair, and the whole city seems to loosen its belt. Fairs brought together noise, goods, drink, performance, novelty, crowds, and strangers. Bartholomew Fair at Smithfield had a long history as one of London's major summer fairs, and by the early modern period it was associated in literature and commentary with a busy mixture of traders, performers, fools, tricksters, and thieves. Ben Jonson's 1614 play used the fair as a setting crowded with schemes, robberies, and social confusion. By the Georgian age, the fair's reputation for unruly entertainment was not a new invention. It was old enough to feel almost traditional. The fair was dangerous because it gave everyone an excuse to behave slightly unlike themselves. Country visitors came to stare, apprentices came to spend, sellers came to shout, performers came to gather circles of attention. Prostitutes, gamblers, tricksters and thieves came because everyone else came. Drink moved through the crowd. So did stories, rumours, laughter and anger. A fairgoer expects to be touched by the fair. That is part of the experience. A puppet show draws him forward. A performer makes him laugh. A boothkeeper urges him closer. Someone behind him curses at someone else. He turns. A purse string loosens, a handkerchief leaves, and because the fair is already half confusion, the crime has to work very hard to seem unusual. Usually it does not. The pickpocket loved any place where people came to look at one thing. That is the deep rule beneath all of this. Markets scattered attention among goods, so they worked in one way. Theatres focused attention on spectacle and status, so they worked in another. Churches gathered attention through ritual, then released it into conversation. Fairs broke attention into fragments of wonder, appetite, noise, and curiosity. Public punishments did something harsher. They pulled thousands of eyes toward the body of the condemned, and while those eyes were fixed on the lesson the state meant to teach, thieves worked among the pupils. Executions at Tyburn took place there from 1571 until 1783, and the Old Bailey's historical material notes that roughly 1,100 men and nearly 100 women were hanged there in the 18th century. These were not quiet punishments hidden from view. They were public events, and several Old Bailey sessions each year were followed by a hanging day in which condemned offenders were carted across the city to be executed before a large crowd near what is now Marble Arch. The crowd was meant to absorb a message. Crime leads here, theft leads here, violence leads here, disobedience leads here. But a crowd remains a crowd, even when it has gathered to watch death. It is difficult to overstate the strangeness of that scene to modern eyes. People came early for a good view. Sellers worked the crowd. Friends of the condemned might appear. Clergy performed their duties. Some spectators prayed. Some jeered. Some drank. Some treated the day as grim entertainment. In such a gathering, emotion itself became cover. A person might be horrified, excited, pious, curious, bored, or eager to tell the story later. Whatever he felt, he was likely looking toward the cart and the rope. A pickpocket in that crowd was looking elsewhere. The terrible irony is clear. The state created a public warning against crime, and the public warning produced one of the physical conditions most useful to criminals. There is a moral discomfort in saying this plainly, but it matters. Public punishment did not remove criminal opportunity from the street. It sometimes concentrated it. The same spectators who came to see justice done could become victims before they went home. A man might leave a hanging with a sermon in his ears and no watch in his pocket. A woman might return from a scene of punishment to discover that someone had lifted a purse from beneath her clothing. The lesson had been delivered, but not necessarily received in the way authorities intended. The pickpocket did not stand outside the moral theatre of Georgian London. He worked the aisles. The bridges and crossings of the city also deserve attention because they made movement predictable. London Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge after its opening in the 1760s, Westminster Bridge from the middle of the century, ferry landings, coach stands and river stairs all created places where traffic slowed and bodies gathered. Crossings are useful to thieves because they impose decisions. A person looks for a gap, watches wheels, avoids mud, turns toward a shout, waits for a cart or searches for a boatman. The body's attention goes outward toward danger in motion. That sounds protective, but it can leave the pockets briefly unwatched. The thief does not need the victim to be careless in every direction. Only one direction must be unguarded. Shops created a quieter version of the same exposure. Georgian retail was full of looking, goods were meant to tempt the eye. Prints, fans, gloves, ribbons, books, buckles, snuff boxes, watches, porcelain and fabrics could pull a passerby to a halt. A halted person disrupts the flow of the pavement. Others press around. The shopper leans toward the window or the open front. For one moment, desire and curiosity do what a thief cannot easily do alone. They separate the mind from the body. A person admiring goods is also displaying himself as someone interested in goods. That may mean money, it may mean vanity, it may mean distraction. All three are useful. Taverns and coffee houses had their own risks. A tavern door at night released men whose judgment had been softened. A coffee house, especially in business districts, gathered men who read newspapers, talked politics, handled letters, made appointments, and carried information as well as money. The coffee house was more alert than the tavern, perhaps, but alertness directed toward argument is still not alertness directed toward the pocket. Men deep in political conversation can become as blind as drunkards for the second a thief needs. This is one of the quieter truths of the street. Intelligence does not protect a person whose attention is elsewhere. A clever man can be robbed while making a clever point. The more you walk through these places, the more obvious it becomes that Georgian London offered pickpockets a full schedule. Morning markets, midday streets, afternoon shops and coffee houses, Sunday church doors, fair days, theatre nights, pleasure gardens in season, execution crowds when the law staged its warnings. The city did not have one dangerous hour. It had changing conditions, each suited to a slightly different method. A thief who understood the day understood where to go next. He did not need the city to be uniformly vulnerable. He only needed to move with its rhythms. This also explains why catching pickpockets was so difficult. A constable could not simply guard every dangerous place because almost every successful public place was dangerous in the right conditions. Before the Metropolitan Police were created in 1829, London relied on a mixed and fragmented system of parish constables, watchmen, magistrates, thief-takers, and later Bow Street officers. Henry Fielding organised the Bow Street Runners in 1749, and his brother John Fielding later expanded their reputation and methods. But even these developments did not instantly transform London into a city of modern policing. The city was too large, too crowded, and too dependent on private prosecution, witnesses, rewards, and sudden pursuit. A place could be known for theft and still remain necessary. People still needed markets. They still attended churches. They still wanted plays. They still crossed bridges. They still gathered at fairs. They still went to public punishments because public life in the 18th century was not something one could retreat from entirely. The pickpocket took advantage of a basic fact. People must enter the world in order to live, and when they enter it, they carry pieces of their private lives with them. Money, keys, letters, watches, handkerchiefs, tokens, bills, and small tools all moved through public space because people moved through public space. The city could warn them, frighten them, punish thieves in front of them, and still the pockets came back into the crowd the next morning. Let us return to one of those crowded places as the evening turns. The theatre is emptying now. The performance has ended, but no one is still. The audience pours into the street, and for a few minutes the pavement holds too many intentions at once. One man looks for his coach. Another laughs too loudly at a line from the play. A servant tries to find his master. A woman gathers her cloak around her shoulders. Someone complains about the press. Someone else pushes back. A boy moves through the edge of the crowd, not quickly enough to draw suspicion, not slowly enough to be caught in one place. He has learned the old lesson. The best hiding place is not behind a wall. It is inside a crowd where everyone has a reason to be distracted, and somewhere nearby a person reaches for a pocket and finds nothing. That gesture repeats across the city in different forms, at the market after paying for fish, at the church door after greeting a neighbour, at the fair after laughing at a performer, at Vauxhall after leaving a lit walk for a darker one, at Tyburn after watching a man die. The hand goes to the place where the object should be and the face changes. Confusion first, then disbelief, then anger, then the frantic search, the turning of the body, the accusation of memory. Who stood near me? Who touched me? Was it the boy? The woman with the basket? The man who asked the way? The person who shoved me at the door? But the crowd has already rearranged itself. That is what crowds do. They erase the exact shape they held a moment before. This was the pickpocket's true escape. Not always speed, not always alleys, not always darkness. The crowd itself changed too quickly to be reconstructed. Witnesses saw pieces. Victims remembered feelings. Constables arrived late. The goods moved away. And because markets, theatres, churches, fairs, pleasure gardens and punishments were all legitimate gatherings, the thief could vanish not by leaving society, but by blending back into it. He had entered the crowd as a stranger. He left it as a stranger. The stolen object was the only proof that for one brief second he had been closer than anyone realised. There were people in London who tried to fight this, and not only by shouting after a fleeing boy. There were constables who watched known thieves, magistrates who gathered intelligence, thief-takers who chased criminals for money, and Bow Street officers who tried to bring method to a city that had long relied on improvisation. Some were honest, some were useful. Some were corrupt enough to make the line between catching thieves and trading with them uncomfortably thin. And that is where the next part of this street begins, not with the hands in the pocket, but with the men who claimed they could stop them, the strange world of rewards, informers, constables, patrols, and professional thief-takers who sometimes understood the criminal city because they stood closer to it than respectable London wanted to admit. By the time a victim realised his pocket had been emptied, the thief was often already gone, and in Georgian London that was where the real difficulty began. Not with the loss itself, though the loss mattered. Not even with the anger, though the anger could rise so quickly that a whole street turned around at the cry of "Stop thief!" The difficulty was what came next. Who was supposed to catch the person who had done it? Who had the authority, the time, the courage, the local knowledge, and the financial reason to follow a pickpocket through alleys, lodging houses, markets, taverns, receivers' rooms, and the dark little spaces where respectable London did not like to imagine itself going? Today we tend to picture crime as something that belongs immediately to the police. Something is stolen, and the machinery of the state, however imperfectly, takes notice. But Georgian London did not have that kind of machinery for most of the 18th century. The Metropolitan Police would not be created until 1829. Before that, London was guarded by a patchwork of parish constables, watchmen, beadles, magistrates, private prosecutors, informers, thief-takers, and later in the century the officers attached to Bow Street. It was not nothing. That is important to say. London was not simply abandoned to crime, but it was not the clean, professional, uniformed system a modern person expects either. It was older, messier, more local, more personal, and far more vulnerable to money, grudges, fear, laziness, and opportunity. The Old Bailey's historical account of policing describes this world as one in which victims, parish officials, watchmen, constables, magistrates, thief-takers, and eventually Bow Street officers all played roles in detection and arrest, often with overlapping responsibilities and uneven results. So imagine the cry rising in a street near Covent Garden. A man has found his watch gone. He shouts. People turn. A boy runs, or perhaps a boy does not run, because he has been trained better than that. Someone points. Someone grabs the wrong sleeve. Someone else says he saw the hand. Another insists the goods have been passed away. The crowd becomes excited because crowds always become excited when there is something to chase. But excitement is not order. It can help catch a thief, and it can also ruin the chance of proving anything. A frightened suspect may be beaten before any officer arrives. A witness may lose sight of the right person. The stolen object may vanish into another hand. And when the first heat of the moment passes, the victim has to decide how much effort, time, and money he is willing to spend pursuing justice. That last part is easy to miss. In Georgian London, prosecution was often a private burden. The state punished, but the victim frequently had to set the process in motion, appear before a magistrate, gather witnesses, attend court, and bear costs in time and sometimes money. For a wealthy man, this was irritating. For a poor servant, apprentice, or labourer, it could be close to impossible. Losing property was bad enough. Spending days trying to recover it while risking wages, employment, or reputation could make the wound deeper. This meant that many thefts never reached the Old Bailey at all. They remained street stories, warnings, curses, and small private disasters. The cases that survive in the records are not the whole ocean of crime. They are the bottles that washed ashore. The people officially responsible for keeping order began at the parish level. The constable was not a modern police officer in uniform, patrolling full-time under a centralised command. He was usually a local man appointed to serve, often temporarily, and the work could be burdensome, unpopular and dangerous. Constables had authority to arrest, bring suspects before magistrates, and respond to disturbances, but they were not everywhere, and they were not necessarily eager to chase a gang of pickpockets into a dark court where every doorway might belong to someone who knew the thief better than the law. Alongside them were watchmen, the night guardians of the parish, who walked rounds after dark, called the hours, carried staffs or lanterns, and were mocked often enough as sleepy, old, underpaid, or useless, that the mockery itself became part of London's folklore. Some watchmen were no doubt lazy, some were frightened, some were simply too few, too poorly supported and too physically overmatched by the city they were expected to guard. London Lives describes 18th century policing as a system involving constables, ex-constables, thief-takers, and later Bow Street officers, with parish structures and private initiative remaining central before modern professional policing took shape. Picture one of those watchmen late at night. He knows the lanes assigned to him. He knows which doors are respectable, which taverns turn rough near closing, which corners gather boys, which lodging houses have a reputation. He may call the hour in a voice that is half duty and half habit. He may hear a footstep and decide whether it is worth investigating. He may see a young man hurry past and know perfectly well that stopping him could mean trouble, and proving anything could mean nothing. We like to imagine duty as a simple thing, but duty in a dark London street was not simple. It was cold, badly paid, lonely, and watched by criminals who often knew the neighbourhood as well as the watchmen did. By daylight, constables might act when someone was seized, when a shopkeeper complained, when a victim brought a suspect, or when a magistrate issued directions. But pickpockets thrived in the seconds before official authority could arrive. Their crime was fast. The system was slow. And between those two speeds stretched the whole strange business of thief-taking. A thief-taker was not exactly a policeman. He was not exactly a private detective in the modern sense either. He was a person who made it his business to catch thieves, recover stolen goods, identify offenders, negotiate with victims, and profit from rewards. Some thief-takers had valuable knowledge of the criminal underworld. They knew receivers, lodging houses, gangs, habitual offenders, and the places stolen property was likely to pass through. In a city without a professional police force, that knowledge could be useful. It could also be poisonous. The Old Bailey's account notes that thief-takers sometimes negotiated between thieves and victims for the return of stolen property in exchange for money, and that their insider knowledge made them both useful and suspect. The Digital Panopticon project, looking at criminal justice records, describes thief-takers as mid-18th century figures who used knowledge of the criminal underworld to profit from prosecution rewards and from victims' rewards for stolen goods, with some making false prosecutions for profit. Parliamentary rewards for prosecutors and witnesses in certain offences, including burglary and highway robbery, were eventually abolished in 1818. This is where the line between law and crime becomes uncomfortably thin. If a man knows thieves because he catches them, that is useful. If he catches thieves because he knows them, that is complicated. If he knows them because he employs them, protects them, betrays them, and turns them in when the reward is high enough, then the whole system begins to look less like justice and more like a market. The thief-taker could stand in the middle of that market with one hand extended toward the victim and the other toward the thief. He might say, in effect, "I can get your watch back. I know the sort of people who take such things. I know where they drink. I know who receives them. Pay me, and perhaps the matter can be solved." To the victim, this could sound like salvation. To the thief, it might sound like business. To us, it sounds very close to extortion. But in a city where the regular machinery was weak, people often turned to anyone who could produce results. The most notorious example was Jonathan Wild, the self-styled thief-taker general, whose career belongs to the early Georgian world, and whose name became almost a warning in itself. Wilde built power by positioning himself as the man who could recover stolen goods and deliver criminals to justice, while also organising and manipulating thieves behind the scenes. He was celebrated for a time because he seemed to make the city safer. In reality, he profited from both sides of the crime. He could protect a thief while useful, expose him when inconvenient, return goods for a fee, and present himself as a public servant while running what looked very much like a criminal network. Jonathan Wild was executed at Tyburn on May 24, 1725, and his fall became a public symbol of the corruption built into thief-taking when profit and justice were allowed to share the same pocket. Think about what that meant to an ordinary Londoner. The person who claimed he could help you might also know the person who robbed you. The man recovering your goods might have arranged their theft or at least benefited from the world that produced it. A thief-taker who brought criminals to the gallows could be feared by thieves, thanked by victims, paid by authorities, and distrusted by everyone with any sense. He was useful because he knew the criminal city. He was dangerous for the same reason. It is the old problem of using wolves to find wolves and then acting surprised when they develop a taste for the flock. Not every thief-taker was Jonathan Wild. Some surely did real work, helped victims, identified criminals, and brought offenders before magistrates. But the occupation itself invited corruption because it rewarded results without always asking too carefully how those results had been arranged. Rewards were meant to encourage prosecution and detection. They also created temptation. If money came with conviction, then accusation could become profitable. If returning stolen goods brought a fee, then recovering property could become suspiciously close to controlling theft. If a thief-taker knew desperate people, he might pressure them into giving evidence, betraying companions, or participating in traps. If he wanted a reward badly enough, he might shape a story to fit the payment. Defence lawyers at the Old Bailey often challenged the motives of policing agents, including men accused of acting as thief-takers, precisely because reward money and criminal knowledge made their testimony morally unstable. The whole system rested on a question no one could answer comfortably. When a man profits from catching criminals, how much crime does he need in order to stay useful? This is not a small question. It sits at the centre of Georgian law enforcement. A city frightened by theft wanted people who could recover property and deliver offenders. But the people best able to do that were often those closest to criminal networks. Respectable distance made a man clean but ignorant. Dirty knowledge made him useful but suspect. The thief-taker stood exactly at that crossing. He could walk into taverns where a parish constable might be mocked. He could speak to receivers who had shut their doors to a magistrate's clerk. He knew nicknames, hiding places, habits, grudges, and prices. He understood which young pickpocket was careless, which woman carried goods, which boy could be frightened into naming an older accomplice. That knowledge could solve a case. It could also manufacture one. Magistrates were the next part of the machinery. They sat between street and court, receiving complaints, examining suspects, taking depositions, and deciding whether a case should move forward. A victim might bring a prisoner before a magistrate after a chase. A constable might bring someone suspected of being a known thief. A thief-taker might present a captured offender, along with the evidence that would support a prosecution. The magistrate's room was not the Old Bailey yet, but it was the doorway to it. For pickpockets, that doorway was terrifying because the law could become very severe very quickly. A stolen handkerchief or watch might seem small in the street, but once translated into legal language, value, intent, prior reputation, and the phrase, "from the person," the theft entered a world where punishments could become life-changing or life-ending. What makes Georgian policing feel so strange is that it combined terrifying punishments with weak prevention. The law could hang, whip, transport, imprison, or send someone to hard labour, but it could not reliably stop the theft before it happened. That imbalance created a city where deterrence was often staged after the fact. The gallows warned, the whipping post warned, transportation warned, Court sentences warned, but the pickpocket worked in the moment before warning mattered. A boy at a theatre door did not experience the law as an orderly presence standing beside every pocket. He experienced it as a danger that might arrive if his hand was seen, if the goods were found, if the witness was steady, if the magistrate believed the case, if the court convicted, if mercy did not intervene. So much of law was conditional. Hunger was immediate. Opportunity was immediate. The pocket was immediate. It was not that the law lacked force, it lacked constant reach. Henry Fielding saw this problem clearly. Better known today as the author of Tom Jones, Fielding became a Westminster magistrate in 1748 and worked from his house in Bow Street, Covent Garden, one of the very neighbourhoods where theatre crowds, markets, taverns and thieves crossed paths daily. In 1749 he began organising a small group of men to apprehend offenders and bring them to Bow Street for examination, the foundation of what became known as the Bow Street Runners. Historic UK summarises the Bow Street Runners as formally trained, paid, full-time officers working with more formality and control than informal thief-takers, while still receiving rewards when they caught suspects. This was not yet the Metropolitan Police. It was smaller, more experimental, tied to the magistrate's office, and dependent on a world that still mixed public authority with reward and private initiative. But it mattered. It represented an attempt to bring method to the chase. Fielding and then his half-brother John Fielding tried to make the detection of crime less accidental, less dependent on corrupt thief-takers, and more rooted in information, records, examination and organised pursuit. The Bow Street officers were not everywhere, and there were only a few of them at first, but their reputation grew because they could act across parish boundaries and because they developed knowledge of known offenders. London Lives notes that the men based at Fielding's house in Bow Street were tasked with locating and arresting serious offenders and bringing them to Bow Street for examination, becoming a more formal element of the city's policing landscape. John Fielding, who was blind, became famous enough as a magistrate that people claimed he could recognise thousands of criminals by voice. Whether that number was exaggerated matters less than what the story tells us about reputation. Bow Street was becoming a place where the city imagined criminal knowledge being collected, remembered and used. A pickpocket who had once relied on anonymity now faced men whose business was to remember him. That was new enough to matter. Still, do not picture a clean triumph of order over disorder. The Bow Street Runners operated in a city too large and too quick for any small group to master. They worked through information, patrols, warrants, rewards, and cooperation, not through omnipresence. They could pursue serious offenders, investigate robberies, watch known thieves at public places, and respond in ways parish officers could not always manage. But they could not stand at every market stall, theatre door, church porch, fair booth, bridge crossing, and tavern entrance. The pickpocket's advantage remained the smallness of his moment. The officer might know the thief by name, but he still had to catch the hand or the stolen goods or the witnesses in alignment. The city did not make alignment easy. There is a useful tension here between the thief's method and the officer's method. The thief wanted confusion. The officer wanted sequence. The thief wanted the object passed away. The officer wanted it found. The thief wanted witnesses uncertain. The officer wanted statements stable. The thief wanted to vanish back into ordinary movement. The officer wanted to separate him from the crowd and turn him into a defendant with a name. A pickpocketing case was, in that sense, a fight over whether a fleeting street moment could be made solid enough for court. The victim's body knew something had happened. The court needed proof. Between those two realities stood the constable, the thief-taker, the Bow Street officer, the witness, the receiver, and the crowd. The crowd was almost always the hardest witness. Crowds see everything and nothing. One person sees a boy near a pocket, another sees a push, another sees someone run, another sees the accused drop something or thinks he does, another is certain the wrong person was seized. Noise alters memory, anger alters memory, fear alters memory. A witness who wants to help may fill gaps without meaning to lie. A witness who wants a reward may sharpen uncertainty into certainty. A thief who knows this can exploit it. He can look astonished. He can accuse someone else. He can say the item was planted. He can insist he was merely passing. He can rely on the fact that, in a busy London street, merely passing was exactly what everyone was doing. Receivers made the work of catching criminals even harder. The receiver was the quiet partner in much of London's property crime. Pickpockets stole small goods, but stolen goods needed a place to go. A watch, handkerchief, buckle, piece of cloth, or purse could not simply be held forever. It had to be sold, altered, broken up, concealed, or moved into a market where its origin would blur. Without receivers, theft becomes harder to profit from. With receivers, crime develops a kind of infrastructure. A receiver might not touch the victim at all, but he made the touching worthwhile. The thief-taker who knew receivers could recover goods. The thief-taker who worked with receivers could control thieves. The constable who did not know receivers was chasing shadows. This is why the policing of pickpocketing was never only about quick pursuit, it was also about intelligence. Who associates with whom? Where do goods go after a fair? Which lodging house has boys coming and going with too many handkerchiefs? Which watchmaker or metal worker is willing to handle suspicious items? Which tavern acts as a meeting place? Which woman has been seen receiving goods from children? Which thief has turned informer? The criminal city was a network, and the people trying to catch criminals had to learn the network or fail repeatedly at the surface. Bow Street's importance lay partly in this attempt to collect and use information more systematically. But information is never innocent in a place where people are paid for it. Informers could save themselves by naming others. Criminals could settle scores by accusing rivals. Thief-takers could build cases around profitable targets. Victims could misidentify suspects in panic. Officers could become too close to the world they watched. Every piece of intelligence carried a human motive attached to it. Georgian law enforcement was not simply a battle between truth and lies. It was a marketplace of stories, some accurate, some distorted, some bought, some frightened out of people, some invented because invention paid. And yet, for all that, people did catch pickpockets. We should not lose sight of that. Street watchers did seize thieves. Constables did bring suspects before magistrates. Bow Street officers did identify repeat offenders. Victims did recover property. Juries did convict. Some children and adults who made a living from other people's pockets found themselves standing at the Old Bailey, hearing their names and the value of the stolen object read out in formal language. The system was flawed, harsh, uneven, and often corrupt, but it was not imaginary. It had teeth. A pickpocket knew that a failed moment could move him from the warm press of a crowd to a cell, then to a courtroom, then to a sentence that might carry him to a whipping post, a transport ship, or a scaffold. The old terror remained because the law, though inconsistent, could be final. What must it have felt like for a child thief to be brought into that machinery? A boy who understood markets and doorways suddenly facing men who understood depositions and indictments. He knew how to pass a handkerchief, but not how to survive a prosecutor's questions. He knew how to run through alleys, but not how to answer a witness who said, "I saw his hand in the gentleman's pocket." Maybe he cried. Maybe he lied. Maybe he looked defiant because older boys had taught him that fear invited contempt. Maybe a thief-taker stood in the room, presenting himself as protector of the public, while the boy knew perfectly well that half the men in that world had bargained with thieves before breakfast. Justice did not arrive to such a child as a pure principle. It arrived as adults speaking over him about value, character, reputation, and punishment. There were efforts at reform across the century, but reform moved unevenly. Concern about public order, property crime, false prosecutions, corrupt thief-takers and inadequate night watch systems pushed London slowly toward more organised policing. The Bow Street model showed that paid officers, information gathering, and magistrates' offices could do more than the older patchwork alone. But resistance to a full police force remained strong for a long time, partly because many English people feared standing armies, arbitrary authority, and the loss of traditional liberties. A modern police force seemed to some like continental despotism imported into English streets. So London lived for decades inside a compromise. Too much crime for the old system, too much fear of centralised power for the new one. In that compromise, pickpockets kept working. The strange business of catching criminals therefore became part of the city's economy just as surely as theft did. A stolen watch could generate money for the thief, the receiver, the person who helped recover it, the constable paid fees, the witness rewarded for conviction, and the court officials whose work processed the case. Crime fed people beyond criminals. This is not to say everyone involved wanted crime to continue. Many wanted order sincerely. But systems develop habits around the problems they manage. Georgian London's criminal justice world was full of people whose livelihoods touched crime so often that crime became, in a grim way, part of ordinary business. That is a difficult thing to admit about any society, but the records make it hard to avoid. Let us bring the scene back down from systems to a single evening. A pickpocket has been caught near a theatre. Perhaps he is young, perhaps grown, perhaps known already to the officers watching the crowd. A man complains of a lost handkerchief or watch. Someone saw the hand. Someone sees the suspect. The stolen item is found not in his pocket but near his feet, or in the hand of another boy, or not found at all. The crowd presses in because people want to see what happens. A constable arrives. The accused protests. The victim insists. The witness repeats what he saw more confidently now because repetition often strengthens memory, whether or not memory deserves it. They begin moving toward a magistrate. The theatre crowd continues around them. Coaches leave. Laughter resumes. The city does not pause for one captured thief. It has too many others to carry. At Bow Street, or before another magistrate, the language changes. The rough cry of "Stop thief" becomes an examination. Names are asked. Residences, trades, ages, reputations. The victim describes the object and its value. Witnesses speak. The officer adds what he knows. Perhaps the accused is recognised as someone seen before at playhouse doors or fairs. Perhaps he gives a false name. Perhaps he has no settled lodging. Those details matter because respectability in court often begins with being locatable. A person with a master, a parish, a family, and witnesses to character stands differently from a person who sleeps where he can and answers questions badly. The law judges acts, but it also listens to the social weight behind the person accused. The pickpocket from nowhere carries very little weight. From there the path could lead to the Old Bailey, and the Old Bailey was not just a building or court. It was a place where the city translated disorder into record. The crowd's confusion became testimony. The missing property became an indictment. The street thief became a defendant. The victim became a prosecutor. The officer became a witness. The value of the object, sometimes absurdly small to our eyes, became legally significant. A handkerchief, a watch, a purse, a few coins, a seal. Each object was named, priced, and set inside a framework of guilt. The court did what courts do. It made a moment legible to power. But that legibility could be cruel. A life could be altered because a few seconds in a crowd were successfully described by the right people in the right language. This is why the business of catching criminals in Georgian London feels so strange. It was both necessary and compromised. Without constables, watchmen, magistrates, Bow Street officers, and even some thief-takers, victims would have had almost no protection at all. With them, the city gained tools to pursue offenders, recover goods, and make examples. But those tools were uneven, sometimes corrupt, sometimes brutal, and often shaped by money. The pickpockets' world and the law's world were not as separate as sermons and statutes pretended. They touched constantly. They drank in the same taverns, spoke through the same informers, fought over the same stolen goods, and met finally in the courtroom where everyone tried to sound more certain than the street had ever allowed them to be. Somewhere after the examination, after the accusation had been written down, after the witnesses had gone home repeating the story to anyone who would listen, the accused waited. Maybe in a lockup, maybe in prison, maybe with other boys who knew the process too well. Outside, London continued to create the conditions that had brought him there. Markets opened again, theatre doors narrowed again, church crowds gathered again, watchmen called the hour again, thief-takers listened for opportunity. Constables hoped their night would stay quiet. Bow Street men watched familiar faces in familiar places. The machinery of catching criminals turned because the machinery of crime kept turning ahead of it. And beyond all of this waited the final public lesson Georgian London loved to believe in. The punishment that was supposed to explain everything, frighten everyone, and close the matter with rope, whip, prison, or exile, even though the crowds who gathered to watch it would arrive with pockets of their own. The punishment was supposed to be the part everyone remembered. That was the idea behind it. Georgian London did not hide its justice away behind walls where only officials could witness it. The law wanted spectators. It wanted bodies in the street, faces turned toward the cart, children lifted onto shoulders, apprentices slipping away from work, servants lingering too long on errands, vendors selling food and drink, and thousands of ordinary Londoners standing together while a condemned person was brought out to die, or to be whipped, or to begin the road toward transportation. Punishment was meant to speak in public. It was meant to say, look carefully, this is where theft leads, this is where vice leads, this is where a hand in another person's pocket may finally bring you. But London had a way of taking even the most serious message and turning it into a crowd, and once it became a crowd, the pickpocket understood it as well as anyone. The final journey for many condemned criminals began at Newgate Prison, that dark, crowded, feared place beside the Old Bailey, where people waited after trial for sentence, reprieve, transport, sickness, or death. Newgate was not simply a prison in the modern sense of ordered punishment. It was a holding place, a warning, a business, a stink, a terror, and for many people the last building they would ever know. Men and women convicted at the Old Bailey might sit there while petitions for mercy moved slowly through the machinery of power. Some sentences would be softened. Some death sentences would become transportation. Some prisoners would be pardoned outright. Some would wait in the condemned hold until the morning came when there was no more waiting to do. The city outside might go on with its selling, shouting, praying, eating, drinking and stealing. But inside, Newgate time must have felt different. Not like the busy time of markets and theatres, not like the careful timing of a thief's fingers, a heavier time. A time counted in footsteps, bolts, keys, prayers, and the question of whether your name would be called. For the pickpocket, the distance between a crowded street and Newgate could be shockingly short. One moment he is part of London's movement, hidden among bodies, judging pockets, reading a doorway, trusting speed. Then a hand catches his collar. A witness shouts. The stolen handkerchief is found, or the watch is produced. A constable is called. A magistrate listens. The Old Bailey receives the case. Words harden around the act. Stealing from the person, value stated, witness sworn, verdict returned. The lively street has become a record, and the record has become a sentence. There is something almost cruel in how quickly the texture of life disappears inside legal language. Hunger, training, fear, bravado, bad company, childhood, drink, desperation, skill, stupidity. All of it is squeezed down until what remains is a name, an object, a value, and a punishment. Not every pickpocket went to the gallows. That matters. Many were acquitted, some were whipped, some were imprisoned, some were transported across the sea. Some benefited from mercy, from doubts about evidence, from juries unwilling to send a person to death for a small theft, or from the complicated system of pardons that softened the bloody code in practice even while the written law remained terrifying. But the gallows stood over the whole world of theft like weather. It did not have to fall on everyone in order to change the air. A boy who lifted handkerchiefs knew or soon learned that the law could become enormous. A woman who took a purse in a crowd knew that the object in her hand might weigh far more in court than it had in the street. A man who made a trade of watches and pocketbooks knew that one bad moment, one steady witness, one recovered object, one officer who recognised him, might carry him toward Newgate and then beyond it. Tyburn was the great public stage of this fear for much of the 18th century. To modern London, Tyburn is almost hidden beneath the ordinary movement around Marble Arch, absorbed into traffic, shops, passing feet, and city noise of a different kind. But for generations of Londoners, Tyburn meant the gallows. It meant the cart ride from Newgate, along a route watched by crowds. It meant the condemned person exposed not only to death, but to the last long performance before death. People gathered along the way. They looked from windows. They pressed into the street. They drank. They prayed. They shouted. They jeered. They wept. Sometimes the condemned spoke boldly. Sometimes they fainted. Sometimes friends came close. Sometimes clergy tried to guide the last minutes toward repentance. The law intended the procession to make punishment visible from the prison to the place of execution, as if the city itself had to watch the sinner move through it before being removed from it. And yet, as strange as it sounds, the hanging day was also an event. Not solemn in any simple way, not quiet, not uniformly moral. It had vendors, noise, excitement, gossip, pickpockets, ballad sellers, and people who came because other people were coming. The condemned person might be the centre of the scene, but the crowd had its own life. Some spectators came with a real belief in justice. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because public death was part of the city's calendar. Some came because there was money to be made from the crowd. Food sellers, drink sellers, pamphlet sellers and thieves all understood that a public gathering was never only what the authorities said it was. The state said, "Come and learn." London heard, "Come and look." The pickpocket heard, "Come and work." This is the part of the story that feels almost too blunt to be real. But it was real in spirit even when specific incidents blurred into legend. People were robbed at executions. The very crowd assembled to watch punishment for crime became a place where crime could happen. A man might stand beneath the moral lesson of the gallows and feel a tug at his pocket. A woman might keep her eyes on the cart and lose a purse beneath her skirt. A curious apprentice might climb for a better view and come down lighter than he went up. It is hard to imagine a more complete confession of the limits of public punishment. The law could build the scaffold. It could bring the condemned. It could gather the crowd. It could pray, preach, warn, and kill. But it could not make every person in that crowd honest. It could not make every hand still. It could not make attention serve morality when attention was exactly what thieves fed upon. Think of the pickpocket at Tyburn, not as a villain in a melodrama, but as a man or boy reading the scene with cold practicality. He knows everyone is looking toward the condemned. He knows the push of the crowd excuses contact. He knows emotion makes people careless. He knows those who have climbed onto carts, posts and shoulders may not be guarding themselves. He knows that when the cart moves, when the prayer begins, when the rope is adjusted, when the crowd murmurs, gasps or surges, 1,000 bodies will forget their pockets for a second. He may even know that the person dying before them had been condemned for a theft not entirely unlike his own. If that thought comes to him, it does not stop his hand. Or if it does stop it once, hunger may start it again another day. The lesson of the gallows had to compete with the lesson of the street. and the street taught daily. By the later 18th century, executions moved from Tyburn to outside Newgate, but the basic problem remained. Public punishment brought crowds, and crowds brought the conditions pickpockets needed. Newgate executions placed the spectacle closer to the court and prison, more contained in one sense, but still public enough to draw a multitude. There is an old confidence in public justice that assumes seeing punishment will make people behave. Georgian London tested that confidence constantly. Some were frightened, certainly. Some people watched a hanging and went home shaken. Some parents brought children because they believed fear would instruct them. Some criminals may have reconsidered their lives for a time, but other spectators drank, laughed, pushed, stole, and treated the day as part warning, part theatre, part holiday. Human beings are not always improved by seeing what they are told should improve them. For the condemned pickpocket, if the sentence did end at the gallows, the last evening before death must have been a different kind of darkness from any street he had known. A thief was used to risk, but risk is not the same as certainty. Risk belongs to movement. Certainty sits down beside you. In Newgate, the sounds of the city could still reach the prison in some form. Wheels, bells, voices. Perhaps the muffled life of streets where other thieves were still moving. Somewhere outside, markets would open again. Somewhere, theatre crowds would gather again. Someone would lose a handkerchief tomorrow. Someone would call for a constable. Someone would teach a boy how to stand near a gentleman without being noticed. The condemned man or boy might know that the world which produced him had not stopped. That may have been one of the bleakest things about it. The punishment could end his life, but not the conditions that made his life likely. There were also those sentenced to transportation, and in some ways their ending was slower and stranger. For many offenders, especially as the century moved on and capital sentences were commuted, transportation meant being sent far from London, first to the American colonies before the Revolution, and later to Australia. To a London pickpocket, transportation was not merely a prison sentence. It was exile from the entire known world. The streets he knew, the alleys, the markets, the receivers, the theatre doors, the parish boundaries, the slang, the faces, the habits of the crowd, all of it became useless knowledge on the other side of the sea. Imagine a boy whose whole education had been London movement, placed on a ship and carried toward a landscape where even the air seemed unfamiliar. A hand trained to lift from a pocket might survive. A body trained to vanish into London could not vanish into a ship's hold. Transportation also shows how the law tried to deal with overcrowding, fear and mercy all at once. Hanging everyone convicted under severe statutes was neither practical nor always publicly acceptable. Juries sometimes lowered values or hesitated to convict when death seemed too harsh. Judges recommended mercy. Petitions were made. Punishment became a negotiation between law's terror and society's reluctance to apply that terror constantly. But from the prisoner's side, mercy could still feel like ruin. To be spared the rope and sent across the world was life. Yes, but life torn out by the roots. For a thief whose identity was built from the London crowd, transportation was a kind of disappearance imposed by the state. Whipping was another public answer, and it carried its own message. The body that had moved too freely through the crowd was now exposed to the crowd. The hand that had gone secretly into pockets was attached to a person made visible, controlled, and punished in the open. Public whipping humiliated as much as it hurt. It told the neighbourhood that this person had been caught, marked by accusation, if not physically marked forever. A young thief might return from such punishment angrier, frightened, ashamed, or harder to frighten the next time. Punishment does not enter every soul the same way. Some people are corrected by pain. Some are broken by it. Some learn only that the world is their enemy and must be robbed more carefully next time. That is one of the uncomfortable truths at the end of this story. Georgian London punished theft severely, but severity is not the same as prevention. A city can frighten people and still fail to protect them. A city can hang a thief in public and still allow children to be trained by receivers in the next parish. It can whip a boy and send him back into the same streets that taught him. It can transport a man and leave another man's hunger untouched. It can preach at crowds who are being robbed while listening. The law's voice was loud. The city's needs were louder. Let us return to the evening after an execution, after the crowd has thinned and the place begins to lose the intensity it held for a few hours. The sellers pack what remains. The curious go home with stories. The pious carry away whatever lesson they manage to feel. The thieves count what they took. A few victims discover losses only when the press is loosened and the chance of finding anyone has vanished. The body of the condemned is gone from the centre of attention, but the talk remains in taverns, in kitchens, in alleys, in lodging houses, in respectable dining rooms where people shake their heads over crime while servants stand nearby hearing every word. London digests the event quickly because London has too much to digest slowly. By morning there will be new errands, new crowds, new money moving through pockets, new warnings ignored because life requires motion. The phrase, "the end of the pickpockets' evening," sounds simple, but there were many possible endings. For one thief, the evening ended in a lodging house with stolen goods divided badly and someone older taking the largest share. For another, it ended in a tavern where success was spent too quickly on drink. For a child, it ended in a corner among other boys, hungry still, because theft did not guarantee fairness among thieves. For someone caught, it ended before a magistrate, or in a cell, or with the slow dread of waiting for trial. For the unlucky or the repeatedly convicted, it might end finally beneath the gallows, watched by a crowd that contained men and boys already searching for their next chance. Each ending belonged to the same city. There is a temptation to imagine that the pickpocket's life was exciting and that temptation is old. London itself fed on stories of criminals, ballads, pamphlets, trial accounts, last dying speeches, criminal biographies, and tavern gossip all turned thieves into figures of fascination. Some were hated, some were admired, some were treated as warnings, some became entertainment after death. The public wanted criminals punished, but it also wanted to hear about them. There is a contradiction in that appetite. Respectable people condemned the thief while buying the pamphlet that described his tricks. They shook their heads at vice while enjoying the cleverness of a well-told theft. The pickpocket lived partly in that contradiction. He frightened the city, and the city made stories from him. But the real life behind the stories was rarely glamorous for long. A working pickpocket had to trust dishonest people. He had to risk sudden violence. He had to accept that a receiver might cheat him, an accomplice might betray him, a thief-taker might sell him, a witness might recognise him, a child he trained might name him, and a stolen object might carry him farther into the law than he intended. He lived in a world where skill mattered, but luck mattered too, and luck is a thin mattress to sleep on. Even successful thieves were often close to ruin. A good day could be spent by night. A bad day could become a sentence. That is not freedom. It is a different form of captivity, one that moves quickly enough to look like choice from a distance. For the victims, the evening after a theft could be quieter, but not less real. A servant might have to explain the loss of money that was not hers. A husband might accuse a wife of carelessness. A tradesman might miss a payment. A gentleman might feel less secure in the city he thought he understood. A woman might replay the market crowd and wonder which face had been close enough. A person robbed in public often loses more than the object. He loses confidence in the invisible boundary around himself. For a while afterward, every bump has meaning. Every child near the pocket becomes suspect. Every crowd carries the memory of that empty search. The pickpocket steals property first and ease afterward. This, more than anything, is how pickpockets took over the streets of Georgian London. Not by ruling them openly, not by making the city lawless in a dramatic, theatrical way. They took over by making ordinary movement uncertain, They made people guard themselves at church doors, theatre entrances, markets, bridges, fairs, and even executions. They turned clothing into vulnerability, crowds into cover, children into instruments, and punishment into spectacle that could be exploited. They forced Londoners to learn a second way of walking through the city, one eye on business, one hand near the pocket, one part of the mind always aware that the person brushing past might not be merely passing. And yet, the city remained alive. That is important. London did not stop gathering because thieves work the gatherings. People still went to markets because they had to eat. They still went to theatres because they wanted pleasure. They still went to churches because they believed, or because respectability required it, or because community lived there. They still went to fairs because noise and colour and foolishness are part of being human. They still watched punishments because their world told them punishment should be seen. The pickpocket did not destroy public life. He lived from it. He was one of its parasites, yes, but also one of its products. A city without crowds could not have supported him in the same way. A city without inequality would have given him fewer prizes. A city without weak policing would have narrowed his chances. A city without hunger would have trained fewer children. Georgian London gave him all of these things, then acted astonished at what he became. Late at night, after the crowds had gone and the watchman's call moved through the streets, there must have been moments when the city seemed almost calm. The market stalls empty, the theatre doors closed, the churchyard quiet, the gallows dark. A stray dog nosing near refuse, a cart left standing, a lamp burning weakly, footsteps passing faster than they needed to. Somewhere a family counted coins and found too few. Somewhere a boy slept with stolen cloth under his coat. Somewhere a constable hoped not to be called. Somewhere in Newgate a prisoner listened to sounds beyond the wall and understood that London was continuing without him. In the morning, the whole thing would begin again. The carts would return. The doors would open. The bells would ring. Servants would be sent out with baskets. Gentlemen would dress, fasten watches, fold handkerchiefs, and step into the street. Women would tie pockets beneath their skirts and move through markets with practised caution. Children would weave between adults, some carrying honest errands, some watching too carefully. Constables would take complaints. Thief-takers would listen for profitable information. Magistrates would hear stories that began with the same gesture again and again. I put my hand into my pocket and it was gone. That sentence, repeated in different voices across the century, is one of the quietest records of Georgian London's fear. It is not a battlefield sentence, not a royal sentence, not the language of Parliament or Empire. Just a hand entering an empty pocket and discovering that the city had reached it first.